the chaotic end of a bitter war. The world's largest airplane is loaded with orphans and headed for safety.
Advancing throttles now.
Time. Go. We needed to get out of missile range.
But only minutes into their escape,
There was this loud explosion, one quick bang.
What was that?
the plane is out of control
I kept going faster and faster and faster.
and headed for the ground.
Prepare for emergency landing! Mom, get down!
And then it was quiet.
South Vietnam, April 1975. After more than 10 years of fighting, the United States is on the verge of defeat. The end of the war is fast approaching. The enemy is closing in on the capital. On April the 4th, at a military base in the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, a strange cargo is being loaded onto an enormous C5A Galaxy. This is one of the largest planes in the world. The C5A is primarily a cargo plane. Its hold is wide enough to carry tanks and tall enough to move buses. Above the cargo area, there's a small number of seats. Both the passenger area and the cargo bay are being pressed into service today. Dozens of Vietnamese orphans are being loaded onto the plane to be flown to safety. There are thousands of orphans to be flown out before the North Vietnamese take Saigon. Barb Adams works for the American Embassy. She and her daughter Linda are also fleeing.
On April 4th, my mom came home and told me that I had 1 hour to pack one suitcase and that we were going to be escorting the orphans on an orphan airlift back to the United States. When my mother and I went upstairs to the troop compartment, there's traditional airline seats, and all of the seats were filled with babies.
Sergeant Ray Snediger is in charge of loading the plane's massive cargo bay.
Make sure it's secure. We got people down there.
It was hard to control the situation. So many people were there, so much news media, so many people from the orphanages, so many military people, that it was actually pure chaos.
Just the day before, American President Gerald Ford announced the start of this desperate mission of mercy, a remarkable effort called Operation Baby Lift.
I have directed that C5A aircraft and other aircraft especially equipped to care for these orphans during the flight be sent to Saigon. I expect these flights to begin within the next 36 to 48 hours.
Arnold Isaacs was covering the end of the war for the Baltimore Sun.
We had transport aircraft flying into Saigon every day, unloading military supplies and going back empty. And so it was decided that they could carry out the orphans on those returning flights. There were a lot of cameras and reporters out there covering the loading and the departure of the plane.
Captain Bud Traynor is in charge of Operation Babylift's first flight.
I got a call from the command post back in the States, and they said to me, how many people could you take out of Saigon if you were asked?
Because of the last-minute nature of the flight, they're running behind schedule. The plane is already 5 hours late, and Captain Traynor wants to be in the air. He orders the cargo bay doors to be closed.
Tell me what.
Doors closed. Loadmaster closed cargo bay doors.
The youngest of the 145 children have been crammed into the upper passenger section of the jet.
My mother and I were both assigned 3 rows of seats with maybe 4 to a row. So it would be 12 to 15 babies that we would be taking care of on the flight, feeding them, changing them, whatever they needed to have done.
Ina? Have a good flight, Ina.
There are 102 older children in the cargo area below. A number of adults from the American Embassy are also down here, keeping an eye on the orphans. Getting out of Vietnam starts by leaving the safety of the US base.
Advancing throttles now.
15. 20. Time. Go.
Gear up.
I remembered that we had to take off at a pretty steep angle. And we didn't have seats, so we were to kneel on the floor between the seats during takeoff.
The cargo plane is heading for Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. It's a 2.5-hour flight. From there, the orphans will be sent to adoption agencies in North America and Australia.
We needed to take off from Saigon and make a very rapid ascent to get out of missile range.
Cargo planes are easy targets. They're slow-moving and large. The possibility of an attack is very real. Just 5 days before, North Vietnamese troops captured the South's second-largest city, Da Nang. South Vietnamese forces are retreating towards Saigon. In the capital, the situation is chaotic. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians are desperate to leave.
Every day, another province was lost, especially after Da Nang fell. The population of Saigon, I think, began to fall into a sort of a paralyzed, petrified terror. Never, not for one moment that I remember, did you have a feeling of anyone rallying to defend the country.
How's the air in the troop
Compartment.
It's all right.
The baby's still squalling, or?
They quieted down with all the noise.
Most are asleep.
Just as well.
Then, shortly after takeoff, as the plane climbs through 23,000 feet,
decompression occurred, the plane filled with this mist. And so until it dissipates, you cannot see.
And there was this loud explosion, one quick bang.
What was that?
And she said, I'm not sure. And you could feel the plane heading downward.
Debris started flying around.
It's a classic decompression. Somewhere there's a massive hole in the plane's fuselage. The air inside the jet is rushing out. At 23,000 feet, there's barely enough oxygen to breathe.
So I looked over at the co-pilot, and he was putting on his oxygen mask, and I thought, I'd better do that too.
The oxygen masks have dropped automatically. But on such an overcrowded flight, there aren't enough to go round. The ones that are available weren't designed to reach babies.
As I looked out the window, I saw the ocean. And I said to my mom, I said, we're crashing, aren't we?
At the back of the passenger compartment, Lieutenant Marsha Wirtz checks in with the crew. From there, she can usually see down to the cargo bay below her.
Pilot, this is Wirtz. I'm at the
Top grade of the troop compartment. I can see
the China Sea out the rear of the plane.
What?
the cargo
Door is gone.
With more than 300 people on board, Captain Bud Trainor's jet has lost its breathable air. Somehow, his massive aircraft has been badly damaged. And he's a long way from a safe place to land. The inaugural flight of Operation Baby Lift will not make it out of Vietnam. The next few minutes will determine if anyone even survives. Oxygen levels are dangerously low. Unlike the passenger compartment above, there are only a few portable masks for passengers in the cargo bay.
My first priority after a rapid decompression is to get the aircraft back down to a breathing altitude for all the passengers, which is 10,000 feet.
Taking it back to the airport.
And so I turned 180 degrees, and now I'm heading back for Saigon.
But before he gets back to Saigon,
Sergeant Snedeker.
Trainer needs to know how bad the situation is.
The airplane is going down in a left bank. At that particular point, I sense that we're going down. I go to the cockpit.
Sir! See what's going on.
And Captain Trainer tells me to go to the cargo compartment to see what's happening down there.
When I was in my descent, I went to my maximum speed, which is what you're supposed to do, to get to 10,000 feet. I got to my maximum speed, and I pulled back on the yoke, and nothing happened. I kept going faster and faster and faster.
Trainer's plane is diving to the ground, and he can't get it to pull up. At the back of the plane, Ray Snedeker descends into the center of the storm.
When I came down, I noticed there was a lot of chaos in the cargo compartment. Obviously, people were frightened. So I'm actually crawling and stepping over people that are combat loaded on the floor. And I saw this huge gaping hole in the back of the airplane. All daylight back there.
And then Snedeker spots what could be an even more serious problem.
Hydraulic fluid is pumping out. Control cables are dangling in the breeze, flopping back and forth, and it just reminded me of looking at some spaghetti. That was the first thought in my mind.
The flight engineer also notices that the plane is losing its hydraulic fluid fast.
Pilot, we've lost number 1 hydraulic system. We've just lost number 2 hydraulics.
Hydraulic fluid helps the crew move the massive control surfaces on the plane. The rudder and elevator at the back, and the ailerons and flaps on the wing. There are 4 separate hydraulic systems on the plane. Now 2 of them are completely empty. And as Trainer dives towards 10,000 feet, his plane is going much faster than it should, and he can't pull up.
And I kept pulling back on the yoke, thinking that I could slow down, pull back more and more and more.
I'm not getting anything out of the yoke. How about you?
Nothing.
And we were just totally puzzled. What is going wrong?
Pulling on his yoke should bring the plane's nose up and slow it down. If he can't pull the plane up soon, it'll plow straight into the ground.
And I'm concerned at that point we're still falling. We're not leveling out.
In the belly of the plane, Ray Snediger reports what he sees to the cockpit.
Pilot! Cargo bay!
Go ahead.
And I told him that the part of the ramp was missing, pressure door was gone, and hydraulic lines and control cables had been cut.
The problem is now much worse than we thought.
Declare an emergency.
Saigon, this is MAC 80218, and we're declaring emergency. We require
Immediate return to base.
Unlike commercial airlines, there was nobody that came onto the PA system and announced what was happening. So I just kind of focused on the children.
After struggling with his crippled jet, Trainer's efforts finally seem to pay off.
And now the airplane levels itself off, and we're saying, wow, thank goodness that we're finally making it out of this.
As quickly as it leveled off, the plane begins to climb again. The nose of the jet begins pulling up into the sky.
And so I relax the yoke, and what happens? Nothing. I'm still going straight up now.
Unless Trainer can gain some speed, his plane will soon stall and tumble from the sky.
And it got higher and higher, and pretty soon I'm going almost straight up.
In desperation, he dips one wing, forcing the nose down.
I'm now in a very, very steep dive, and there's nothing I can do, seemingly, to bring the nose up. And so, counterintuitive, I added power, and when I did that, the airplane pulled itself out of the dive, and I started to go back up again, but this time I stopped it at 10,000 feet and rolled out, and I realized that I had learned how to control the airplane.
Trainer can't control his plane's pitch as he usually does, by pushing and pulling on his control column. Instead, by gently increasing and decreasing power to his engines, he seems to be able to keep his plane level.
At that point, I realized that my only pitch control was the throttle.
The plane has descended to 10,000 feet. There's now enough oxygen to breathe.
100. It's safe to remove our mask. Gear down. Before landing checklist.
I headed directly for Saigon and began a descent and began positioning myself for a final, much like you would in a glider.
Don't worry. They're taking care of it up in the cockpit. We're gonna be down soon.
I'm trying to provide comfort to these passengers. At the same time, I know we're in serious trouble because the airplane is still going down.
Captain Trainer has coaxed his injured jet down to just over 4,000 feet. 11 kilometers from the airport, he turns his jet to line up with the runway when his plane surprises him again.
In the final turn to the runway, when I banked the airplane, the nose dropped and I couldn't continue my turn. I had to level the wings so that I had enough lift that the nose didn't keep descending.
Captain Trainer had to stop turning before he could line up with the runway. He's now losing altitude fast, and his prospects are becoming increasingly grim.
While we were working in the cargo compartment, the loadmaster came to me and said, we need to get upstairs because we're going to crash land. When I get to the top of the ladder, I've changed my mind and think I need to be in the cargo compartment when this airplane does get on the runway so I can help evacuate down there. As I try to leave, the flight engineer grabs me by my left elbow, throws me into a seat, and about the time I hit the seat, I can hear the ground screaming. It's a loud scream. It's coming closer.
Prepare for an imminent crash landing.
Get down on the floor! Prepare for emergency landing! Mom, get down!
When we started to go down, my mother and I were focusing on what should we be doing to brace for impact.
We had a big open field in front of us. When I got within about 200 feet of the ground, I said,
"We're going in."
The plane is hurtling towards the ground at almost 500 kilometers per hour.
I reach down, grab my seatbelt, and when the seatbelt snaps,
we touched the ground relatively easily, and we popped back in the air. The jump seat said to me, "Bud, we're gonna make it." But I could see looming ahead of me was this huge, huge river. So I added power.
My mom was on one side of the aisle, and I was on the other. And she says, "Come over here and sit with me."
And even with full power at that point, I was still continuing to sink.
my whole life went into slow motion. The airplane is coming apart where I'm sitting. All kinds of debris is flying through the air. And it went on and on and on. It seemed like forever.
When I was going upside down, I remember saying, goodbye to my wife a couple of times, because I was gone. And then it was quiet.
When the plane came to a stop, I looked for my mom. I didn't see her anywhere. At that point, it was all a little bit surreal that I didn't even really know what had just happened. All I knew was that we needed to get the babies out of there.
Trainer and the rest of the cockpit crew have survived.
When I stepped out of the window, what was clear after you looked around, the airplane broke up into its component parts. The tail dropped off, the flight deck broke away, the troop compartment and the wings, they separated from the cargo compartment. The cargo compartment itself disintegrated, essentially.
Behind the cockpit, the plane's wings, which hold the fuel tanks, are burning. The passenger section of the plane is largely intact and separated from the scorching heat of the burning wings. Lieutenant Wirtz and many others who had been in the passenger section survive.
Then we started bringing babies out. And I could hear some helicopters coming. At that point, I was not looking for my mother because I had been assured that she was okay. I was to go to the hospital and just wait for her there. And then that's when I took a couple of the babies and walked over and got on.
A day that began with the promise of hope has ended in disaster. Just minutes after the crash of the first baby lift mission, rescue workers are on the scene searching for survivors. Almost everyone in the cargo area was killed instantly when the plane slammed down the second time. The dead, the injured, and the survivors are taken to hospitals in Saigon and Thailand.
Since I was not injured, I just took a seat and was waiting for my mother while they brought in a lot of the babies. Then somebody came over to me and told me that my mother had died. I remember holding on for dear life, so she said, "Come over here and sit with me."
Barb Adams' last decision was to be near her daughter.
Just as I sat down on the floor, we must have hit. She flew forward somewhere. And that's the last time I saw my mother.
"175 people survived the crash of the Air Force jet. But more than 150 have been killed. More than half of them were children.
And it was really such a blow in what had already been a very tragic and sad story of the collapse of South Vietnam. And then who would have thought that in the middle of all that tragedy, that the American Air Force would crash a plane full of Vietnamese babies and small children.
The investigation begins immediately. The next day, along with the investigators, Captain Bud Traynor returns to the smoldering wreckage of his plane on a special mission of his own.
I had to leave a couple of crew members out at the aircraft. And so I went back the next morning.
The bodies of 2 dead crewmen are still pinned down by the wreckage.
So we took a lot of tie-down chains and put them together and did the old heave-ho with a whole lot of people to move the flap of wreckage that was pinning the 2 crew members. And we got them out of there. It's always important to finish the job, and we did. But then I had a very naive approach to what was going to happen next. I kind of envisioned the guys in the silver helmets and put out the white rope. This is going to be a secure site. And that was when I got the shock that, hey, there are no guards out here. There's a Vietnamese soldier going through my suitcase wearing my flight jacket. And he had an AR-15, and I didn't.
That's my jacket. I'm Bud Traynor.
And we established that my coat had the same name on it.
That's mine.
As my flight suit. And so the coat he was wearing was mine. So he begrudgingly gave me my coat and then proceeded to go through the rest of my suitcase.
It's not only Trainer's jacket. Looters are picking the plane clean. Dave Scheiding is a structural engineer with the Air Force.
When we got to the site, we had some concern to begin with because there was a tremendous amount of civilian people out there actually picking up parts, which, of course, that didn't help us much as far as the investigation goes.
He's part of a team that goes to Saigon to try to figure out why the plane crashed.
This investigation was very unique from a couple of standpoints. The first standpoint, of course, the people taking parts away from us, but second, the country was in extreme chaos. It was essentially falling.
Frank Huskin is also part of the investigative team.
The NVA and the VidCong are all around, and we were only out there during the daytime, but it was a very uncomfortable feeling. Very uncomfortable feeling.
One of the first things we wanted to rule out was sabotage and a bomb. So we brought in dogs from the Philippines, bomb-sniffing dogs.
Taken back there to the rear of the plane.
With North Vietnamese soldiers so close, a direct attack or sabotage are obvious theories.
Initially, they had all thought that it had been a bomb placed in the luggage compartment, or it had been a missile that shot the plane down.
During the rush to board the aircraft, personal luggage was loaded but not thoroughly checked. This added to the speculation that a bomb may have been smuggled on board. The dogs find no trace of a bomb, and investigators find no evidence of explosive residue on the plane. It clearly wasn't attacked, but something had caused the cargo door to fail.
We had to find the doors, if at all possible, to make sure that we didn't have a problem with other C5s that would cause this type of crash.
Soon, the massive C5As will be desperately needed to get America out of Vietnam. Finding out what happened to this one couldn't be more urgent.
It was beyond important. At the time, we had approximately 100 C5 aircraft. We grounded the C5s until such time that we could figure out, one, what the problem was, and two, what were we going to do to prevent it from happening again.
Hey, guys!
As they examine the wreckage, investigators also try to find out why the crew had such difficulty controlling the plane.
Look how this is sheared off.
The cables that Ray Snediger saw leaking hydraulic fluid were the ones that controlled the plane's elevator. Since the elevator controls pitch, Captain Trainer had no way of guiding his plane up and down.
Cargo bay!
Declare an emergency. Saigon.
Emergency. Return to base.
When there's no control of the elevator, which allows for up and down pitch, an airplane will set up an oscillation up and down. His oscillation started as nose was going down, and then it picked up speed, and then it started pitching up.
A falling plane's aerodynamic properties will force it to follow a predictable pattern. As lift increases, the nose naturally tilts upwards. Without the elevators to counteract the motion, it will continue until the plane moves so slowly that it stalls, falling back to the ground. It explains the strange motion of the giant C5A. By adjusting the thrust to his engines, Trainer was able to keep the jet from rising and falling. Investigators believe the cables were sheared off when the cargo door exploded from the plane. But they still don't know why the door failed in the first place.
Then we made the determination we were going to have to try and find the doors.
But the doors are somewhere at the bottom of the South China Sea.
Our next problem was trying to figure out the ballistics of those doors. Nobody had ever even thought of figuring out ballistics of two doors flying through the air from 23,000 feet.
Relying on the airspeed and the altitude at the moment of decompression, investigators learned the plane was 46 kilometers from the coast of Vietnam.
When the doors went out, the airplane was moving across the water at about 600 feet per second. Therefore, we had to come down with a pretty good estimate for the Navy to even know where to look.
Ships from the U.S. 7th Fleet crisscross the South China Sea looking for the rear door. For the first several days, they can't find anything. The South China Sea has swallowed the evidence. At the crash site, investigators are becoming increasingly frustrated. A great deal of wreckage has been stolen by scavengers. An important clue could be among the pieces taken away. To retrieve these parts, the Air Force offers to buy them back.
The strategy was to provide leaflets throughout the city of Saigon and the surrounding area. We want every piece of material from the aircraft back, and we will also pay you if you will turn this in to us.
11 days after the crash, flyers are delivered to local officials and distributed throughout the city. Investigators do eventually recover the camera that was used by a film crew on board the plane. They hope it can show them exactly what happened. But the film inside the camera has already been removed. Another piece of the wreck turned in during the buyback program is just what they're looking for.
We were trying to get the black boxes back because that's the thing we really wanted.
All C5As are fitted with a computer system that records vital information about the plane's operation. It records engine settings, airspeed, altitude, and hundreds of other parameters onto a magnetic tape. The system is called Mayday, Malfunction Detection Analysis and Recording System. It wasn't found at the crash site. The Mayday is eventually returned for a reward, but it proves to be a disappointment.
It didn't identify the reason for the doors and the ramps failing, but it did provide us a sequence of events in a lot of areas, including altitude, airspeed, the performance of the aircraft itself during that time frame.
As investigators continue to look for the cause of the crash, the situation in Vietnam gets worse. 2 days after they receive the Mayday, the South Vietnamese president resigns. On April the 23rd, 100,000 North Vietnamese troops approach Saigon. The noose around the city is tightening quickly.
While we were out in the rice paddy, you could see burning hamlets and villages, and in the distance they were on fire. You could hear the explosions and so forth of mortars.
While the situation in Vietnam continues to unravel, the US Navy finally has some success at sea. On April the 26th, they find the cargo ramp and part of the pressure door of Trainer's plane. If investigators don't find the answers here, they may not find them anywhere. They're running out of time, and they're running out of leads. When the ramp is examined, investigators make a disturbing discovery.
On that ramp, 2 of the stirrups were in great condition. They were perfect. They had not failed, so obviously it told us that at least 2 of the locks had just unlocked themselves.
The C5A has 14 locks holding the rear cargo door shut, 7 on each side. The door recovered from the sea tells investigators that for some reason, 3 of the locks designed to hold it shut had either unlocked in flight or had never locked at all.
This flight was actually like a ticking bomb. When they closed the ramps, all those locks would look like they were in a locked position. When it took off, the fuse was lit. And as the aircraft climbed out, the fuse kept burning.
As the plane climbed away from Saigon, the pressure outside the jet dropped. The air inside pushed with increasing force against the cargo door. Then, as the plane passed through 23,000 feet, with 3 latches unlocked, the pressure on the door was too much.
With the 3 locks that failed all in a row, it was just too much load for the other 4 locks to actually pick up, and what's resulted in a catastrophic failure of the ramp itself.
But investigators still don't know why the locks failed. Before they can find the answer, the situation in Vietnam deteriorates completely. Saigon is under siege. On April the 27th, the investigators take all of the evidence they can and leave. It's simply too dangerous to stay.
When we left Saigon, we were the last 2 C-141s to leave Tan Son Air Base. They were essentially losing their country at that time, and after that it was only helicopters that got out.
Investigators hope they have all the clues they need to solve the mystery of the crash. They know they won't be coming back to Vietnam to look for any more. April the 30th, 1975. The war in Vietnam ends. From the rooftop of the American embassy, the last remaining Americans in Vietnam are flown to safety. Back in the United States, investigators continue their work. Since the C5 is in service around the world, they need to know why 3 locks on the cargo door failed.
When we got back to Texas, it was to help us verify the failure sequence.
Investigators discover something potentially alarming about the cargo plane's rear door. Parts from the C5A were actually removed from the plane, cannibalized to service another cargo plane. The locks on the rear door of the C5A are connected to each other by a series of tie rods. The rods can be lengthened or shortened to ensure the locks are completely closed. It's these tie rods which were removed from the baby lift plane. At the time, the enormous cargo planes were in constant demand.
The Air Force was very short of parts, and so they came up with a standard practice for maintenance that they could cannibalize parts off of aircrafts that are not being flown. It's authorized, and it's a good operation if you respect it and treat it properly.
The tie rods were replaced before the baby lift plane left for Saigon, but for some reason they hadn't held. To try to figure out what happened, investigators rebuild one of the locks that was supposed to keep the rear door closed.
We essentially built a working model of that ramp, and we had to do that because we didn't get all the parts back because of the people picking them up, parts out in the ocean and everything that we never got back.
Investigators aren't convinced that the problem is in the basic design of the lock. They suspect that before the plane left California, the engineers who replaced the rods didn't follow the proper procedures.
When we're talking about the locks, the distances that we're talking about are very, very small. We could be talking about a 16th, 32nd of an inch difference between being locked and unlocked.
The re-rigging was done before the plane left the United States.
Show me how you re-rig it.
After the locks were re-rigged, they should have checked to make sure they were working. That wasn't done. Without the check, no one would have noticed that the re-rigging was done improperly.
I would say that this accident actually started back at Travis Air Force Base in California. When the 2 tie rods that had been cannibalized earlier were replaced, they were not installed properly.
Loadmaster, close cargo bay doors.
When the door was opened and shut in Saigon, there was a warning that not everything was perfect.
We had some difficulty getting it to lock, so we had to open and close it 3-4 times. But it seemed to be routine, and in the heat of the moment, we didn't think anything about it.
But 12 minutes after liftoff, as the plane continued to climb, The 3 improperly closed locks were forced open by the building air pressure. The remaining locks could not take the extra load. The cargo door burst open and was torn off the fuselage.
You just can't take shortcuts. And if it's pulled a couple of rods out, run out and put them back in, that's not going to hack it.
The investigators have found their answers, and in their final report make specific recommendations that will make the C5A safer. As a result, the Air Force designs a pin that slips through each lock. If the door isn't properly shut, the pins can't slide into place.
We essentially Murphy-proofed it by putting steel pins in there so that when the lock is in the over-center position, if you can insert these safety pins, then you know that the system is properly rigged.
Ray Snediger retired from the Air Force as a Chief Master Sergeant.
This mission was probably the most discouraging in some ways based on part of the outcome. But also, it was refreshing in the fact that we displayed such good airmanship, such courage, and we were able to save so many people.
After 28 years of service, Bud Traynor retired from the Air Force as a colonel.
I think everyone second guesses themselves to see if there was something else that they could do. I am very fortunate in that I never found something that I said, I sure wish I had done X. It just wasn't there.
That pilot did a super job. The fact that anybody survived this crash is just remarkable. The ones that were saved are very fortunate that that particular crew was in charge of that aircraft. Being a pilot myself and knowing they only had 1 aileron and 4 engines, by rights they all should have been dead.
Investigation Board does not normally recommend decorations. That's not part of their job. But in this case, we recommended to the Air Force that they be considered for a high decoration.
Surviving crew members, including Captain Bud Traynor and Sergeant Ray Snediger, were awarded medals by the Air Force for heroism and extraordinary achievement. One of the orphans that survived was baby Ina.
Ina?
Today, she's known as Kelly Jackson Brownlee.
April 4th, 1975. It's definitely a pivotal point in my life where I left part of myself behind in Vietnam.
When Operation Baby Lift resumed, Kelly, along with hundreds of other orphans, were flown to the United States. She was eventually adopted by a family near Seattle, Washington.
There was a 25-year anniversary in April of 2000, and it brought together all of the adults that were adopted from Vietnam. And I ended up meeting someone who was very special and actually ended up marrying.
Chris Brownlee and his wife Kelly were both airlifted out of Vietnam on April the 5th, 1975, one day after the crash.
Lost engine number 2.
High above the Mediterranean, 2 pilots struggle with a stalled engine.
Engine relights. Negative.
Stop. Engine 1 is flamed out.
45 miles from land, the pilots make a difficult decision.
Prepare to ditch. Oh my God, be merciful.
Passengers are forced to make life or death decisions on their own.
Do not inflate your vest!
The accident will tear families apart. set in motion a massive rescue effort at sea, and trigger a multinational investigation to discover why both engines on one of the world's most popular planes stopped in mid-flight.
Mayday, Mayday.
August the 6th, 2005, Bari, Italy. An ancient port town on the Adriatic Sea, where the past meets the present. Just north of this historic city, Bari International Airport serves 10 major airlines and more than 1.5 million passengers each year. One of those carriers is Tunisia's Tuninter Airlines. Captain Shafiq Garbi is a pilot with Tuninter. Today, he's in command of Flight 1153. The 45-year-old Tunisian is a military-trained pilot with a flawless flight record. Garbi's co-pilot is 28-year-old Ali Kabair.
How much fuel are you adding?
400 kilograms.
2,700 total?
Yes.
Captain Garbi and his co-pilot flew from Tunis to Bari this morning to collect 34 Italian passengers. Now they're going to fly them to Djerba, a Tunisian resort island. Among the passengers is 31-year-old police officer Luca Squicciarini. His girlfriend Paola is traveling with him.
Our first choice wasn't Djerba, it was Cape Verde. The thing with Cape Verde is that it was a period of terrorist activities. The flight would have left from either Rome or Milan. Since they are two large airports, Paola was afraid that there would be an attack, so we chose not to go to Cape Verde. It was my first trip with Paola. We met the previous winter. We had plans to marry the following year.
To tighten your belt, pull on the loose end of the strap. To release your seatbelt, lift the upper portion of the buckle. Ladies and gentlemen, your life vests are located beneath your seats. To inflate the vest, pull firmly on the red cord, only when you're leaving the aircraft. If you need to refill the vest, blow into the mouthpiece.
TS LBB, flight 1153, permission for takeoff granted.
Roger that. Clear for takeoff. Final prep for departure.
The crew is flying a French-made ATR-72. The small turboprop is perfect for short flights. It doesn't need a lot of maintenance or guzzle a lot of fuel. Just after 2:30 in the afternoon, the plane takes off. 49 minutes after takeoff, Flight 1153 is 400 miles away from its destination, Djerba.
So we started chatting with other passengers. We were all excited. We talked about the vacation.
Like Luca and Paola, Barbara Baldacci is on her way to Djerba for a vacation with her fiancé Francesco.
Barbara
was 23 years old. She was on the verge of realizing her lifelong dream of graduating in biology. After writing her final exam, she decided to take this vacation with her fiancé, Francesco.
Then 75 miles from the nearest land, and 23,000 feet above the sea, the plane's right engine stops working.
We've lost engine number 2. Let's get to 17,000 feet.
TUI 1153, request 170.
TUI 11.
Captain Garbi begins an emergency descent.
Sending 170.
When you have a single engine flameout, you would descend down to a lower altitude, the air is thicker, the propeller is more efficient.
Under current conditions, the ATR-72 can best fly on one engine at an altitude of 17,000 feet.
Power lever, flight idle, start button.
The crew struggles to restart the right engine.
Negative. Fuel supply, check.
But then, less than 2 minutes after the first engine quits,
Stop! Stop. Engine number 1 is flamed out.
both of the plane's engines have stopped.
Si è spento inizialmente il motore destro.
The engine shut off.
Inizialmente pensavamo fosse addirittura un
Our
attentato,
first thought was of a terrorist attack, since there were so many at the time. We tried to figure out what was happening, so we looked towards the cockpit to see if someone was trying to sabotage the plane.
Se qualcuno voleva sabotare l'aereo.
The plane is now falling to the sea at 800 feet per minute.
Mayday! 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 DUI 1153. We have lost both engines. Request immediate landing at Palermo.
The crew still hopes to reach an airport, but they have 70 miles of ocean to cross before they're over land. Crews are trained for almost anything. There's a checklist for them to follow to solve most problems, including what to do when both engines die.
Both engines flame out checklist. Fuel supply, check.
The pilots don't know why their engines have stopped. The only clue they're getting is a low fuel feed warning.
A low pressure warning light tells the pilot that there's low fuel pressure going to the engine. Now that could be a mechanical problem, or that could be a contamination problem.
The crew follows the steps laid out by the manufacturer to relight their dead engines.
Fuel supply, check. Power lever, flight idle. Start button. Engine relight. Negative.
Get Shokri.
The captain asks the cabin crew to bring the onboard engineer, Shokri Habui, to the cockpit.
Palermo approach. This is TUI 1153. We have lost both engines. Request immediate landing.
The closest airport is in Palermo, on the Italian island of Sicily.
TUI 1153, Palermo. Affirmative, you are clear for landing.
Palermo approach. What is our distance to the airport?
Your distance to Palermo is now 48 nautical miles.
An ATR-72 will fall from the sky at a predictable rate. 1 foot down for every 16 feet forward. 48 nautical miles is further than the plane can glide.
I don't think we're gonna make it.
If they can't restart their engines soon, they'll be forced to ditch in the sea.
Ditching at sea is a very difficult decision to make because it's the hardest thing to do. You have swells, waves, wind. Is anybody going to see you? How long can the plane float for?
Landing a passenger plane on water is extremely dangerous. In 1996, an Ethiopian Airlines pilot was forced to bring his 767 down on the Indian Ocean. The ditching was recorded by a tourist on a nearby beach. 50 people survived, but 125 people died. The crew of this small plane doesn't usually include an engineer. When there is one on board, he usually travels in the cabin.
I remember this person looked at the stewardess and shook his head as if saying no after the second engine had shut off.
Per cui allo spegnimento di tutti e due I motori. Per cui lì ho capito che stava cercando di fare qualcosa per
That gesture showed there was nothing left to do.
per far funzionare quest'aereo, però mi sa.
The crew of Flight 1153 has tried all it can. They're running out of time and options. Flight engineer Shokri Habui has joined in the struggle to get Flight 1153's engines started.
You've run the checklist?
Yes.
The captain hopes the engineer will know something that isn't covered by the checklist.
Attempt to restart the engines. Right engine first.
Fuel supply, check. Engine 2 start, power button, on. Engine relight, negative.
Palermo approach, TUI 1153. Any closer airport where we can land?
Negative 1153.
Palermo Airport is the closest airport to your position.
We're not going to make it. Prepare to ditch. Oh my God, be merciful.
A me non hanno detto nulla. Io mi sono accorto che qualcosa non andava.
No one said anything. I noticed something wasn't right because the two engines shut off. More than once, I tried to get the stewardess's attention, asking what I should do. If I had to put on the life jacket, if I had to stand, if I should take off my shoes. I got no answer. She was in shock and started to cry.
Era sotto shock e ha pianto.
The senior flight attendant does give the passengers direction.
The captain has decided to land the plane at sea.
I'll let you imagine the panic on board. People were screaming and crying.
Please stay calm and follow your crew's instructions.
There were people in the front seats that had a baby girl. She had been playing and was so excited. To now see the panic in her mother's face made me feel so sad.
TUI 1153. What is your fuel load?
Cockpit fuel quantity 1,800 kilograms.
Captain Garbi's fuel gauge shows that he has plenty of fuel. But for some reason, neither engine will restart. Just 10 minutes after the trouble began, the plane is 7,000 feet above the ocean and falling. Outside, it's completely silent. But in the cabin, there's panic.
Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened.
My first instinct was to undo my seatbelt to prevent getting trapped when we hit the water. I didn't want to be trapped in my seat and go down in a horrible way. Secondly, I put on my life jacket and quickly blew it up. I did this to soften the blow of the impact.
Il giubbino di salvataggio e l'ho gonfiato subito.
Do not inflate your vests until you left the plane.
A plane ditching at sea will more than likely fill with water. That's why safety procedures call for passengers to only inflate their life vests once they've cleared the plane. Otherwise, they could become trapped inside the flooded fuselage and drown. In the Ethiopian Airlines crash, many passengers ignored this advice and drowned after surviving the initial impact.
Negative.
The dead engines aren't the only problem confronting the crew.
Engine 2 start, power.
Many of their instruments get their power from the engines. Without the engines, some vital gauges are dead.
On a two-engine flameout, you go on your standby instruments, which is you have an attitude indicator, you have an altimeter.
Fuel supply, check.
The crew continues to try to restart their engines, but it's become clear that they've run out of time.
They're not doing anything.
Confirm distance, please.
Your distance is now
20 miles.
Boats. I see boats.
Choosing to ditch near a ship or a vessel is not written in any checklist. It's just good airmanship because the rescue can start immediately and it increases your chances of survival.
Palermo approach. It's TUI 1153. We can't make it to the airport. We see two boats on the left side. We're going there. If you can, please call.
Captain Garbi turns his plane towards the boats.
Can you send helicopters or something similar? Fast, fast, fast.
emergency. All marine units, aircraft in distress, 20 nautical miles off Palermo.
Even before the plane hits the water, rescuers are on their way.
I had very little information. We didn't know the nature of the crash or anything about the plane.
Autopress. Dump.
Although it's a rare maneuver, There is also a checklist for ditching a plane in the water. Before ditching, the crew ensures all landing gear is retracted to help the plane land more smoothly.
Landing gear lever up.
When pilots ditch, they want their airplane as streamlined as possible so that it glides across the water when it hits. Pilots must not only monitor the systems on the plane, they also have to assess conditions at sea. They don't want to hit a wave head-on.
If you hit perpendicular to the waves or swells with the aircraft, it's like hitting concrete. The plane will break up.
Passengers can see what's coming.
I was hanging on tight to the seat in front of me, and through the window, I could see the impact was imminent.
The crew is 700 feet above the sea.
You're with me, Ellie, huh? Careful. Shokri, ready?
Ready.
Here we go. There is no other God but Allah. Muhammad is his messenger. In the name of God, merciful, merciful.
At a speed of 145 miles an hour, the plane collides with the sea.
I lost consciousness. I woke up in the water. I was 2 or 3 meters underwater. I came up to the surface wearing only my pants. I had lost my life jacket and clothes on impact. I got to the surface and grabbed onto a bag. I was in shock. I was surrounded by everything. My thoughts were constantly with Paola. I thought I was going to die because I was spitting blood. I felt my lungs filling with blood.
Captain Garbi survives, but has been seriously injured. Co-pilot Ali Kabair has also survived, but flight engineer Shokri Haboui is killed. No one aboard the nearby boat saw Flight 1153 crash into the sea. The plane has broken into 3 pieces. The tail section and much of the fuselage sink to the bottom of the sea. But the largest section, containing the 2 wings, stays afloat. It becomes a makeshift life raft for survivors. But not all of the passengers have survived. Many haven't made it out of the plane and to the surface. A fleet of rescue personnel are en route, including Admiral Vincenzo Pace of the Italian Coast Guard. Rescuers must travel 26 miles through heavy seas to get to the crash site.
The sky was very visible, but the water was agitated. This caused some problems to the recovery mission.
Helicopter pilot Stefano Borigana is one of the first to arrive at the scene.
The approach control asked us if we were aware of ditched aircraft out of the coast of Palermo, and if we were able to help them to locate the airplane. When we approached the airplane, we could see the wings floating. There were several people in the water around the aircraft, all floating, and everybody with their jacket inflated.
Borigana spots Luca Squicciarini floating, away from the main wreckage.
There was one man without his jacket, and he was the farthest from the airplane. I decided to go over him and throw one of our life jacket to him.
The Coast Guard arrives and begins pulling survivors from the sea.
The actions of the people in the water made us very agile. Because of what they were doing, we ourselves did not panic. We had the calm collaboration of all these people because despite what happened, they knew help was coming and they would be rescued.
Within the hour, the crash site is teeming with rescuers. They search for survivors from the water and from the air. "23 people are pulled from the Mediterranean Sea. But 16 have died in the crash, including Paola Di Ciaula.
My relatives told me a couple days later, while I was still at the hospital. I had no reaction. Paola was gone. I reacted when I got home. When I got home and went to the cemetery, I realized what was happening. That's where I got really down.
Barbara Baldacci and her fiancé Francesco are also killed.
Sembrava impossibile che potesse essere successa una tragedia.
It seemed impossible that this terrible tragedy would happen, because Barbara and Francesco were great swimmers.
Erano nuotatori, avevano il brevetto di nuotatori.
They used to go underwater without any problems. How is it possible that many on that plane saved themselves and they didn't? I was stunned and incredulous.
Io rimasi incredula ed impietrita.
It's quite likely that none of those who died ever had a chance to swim to safety. Their serious injuries would have prevented them from escaping after the plane hit the water. In this accident, most of the survivors were seated in the rear of the plane. Most of those who died up front. Those sections, along with some valuable clues, are now at the bottom of the sea. The one section that didn't sink is towed to the port in Palermo and taken to a nearby hangar. A team of agents from Italy's National Flight Safety Agency, the ANSV, begin looking for leads. Their job, find out why Flight 1153's engines stopped in mid-flight.
We need to collect as much as evidence as possible in order to fulfill two main answers. What happened and why had it happened?
They are led by Chief ANSV investigator Vincenzo Panetta.
I arrived in Palermo the day after the accident, on the 7th, very early in the morning.
Per piacere, permesso. A flight test engineer by training, Panetta has led several air crash investigations. The engines and central fuselage of Tuninter Flight 1153 have been recovered. The rest of the plane lies somewhere off the Sicilian coast.
The main challenge of the investigation was the fact that the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder and also the front fuselage were 1,500 meters under the sea.
While the Italian Navy conducts a deep-water search for the rest of the wreck and the crucial black boxes, Italian investigators are given some assistance by the plane's European manufacturer. ATR's Giuseppe Caldarelli is here to find out if there's a flaw with the company's plane.
Anytime there is an accident, and also one people die, for me is a big accident.
Worldwide, hundreds of ATR-72s cross the skies each day.
Those aircraft have a very sound structure and robust systems, and are very cost-efficient.
Together, Panetta and Caldarelli set out to find why both engines on such an advanced airplane died in mid-flight.
TUI 1153, we have lost both engines.
Before it happens again.
Captain Garvey, how are you?
I'm getting better, thank you.
Investigators want to know what happened in the cockpit of Tuninter Flight 1153 when the engines died. Without the cockpit voice recorder, they must rely on the recollections of surviving passengers and crew members.
The main cause of double engine failure could be a lack of fuel.
But according to Captain Shafiq Garbi, lack of fuel was not the problem.
What were your fuel readings?
The fuel quantity indicator said 1,800 kilograms of fuel.
What is your fuel load?
Cockpit fuel quantity 1,800 kilograms.
Fuel supply, check.
Was there any warning that you were low on fuel?
There was definitely no low fuel warning. Just a low feed pressure light.
The absence of a low fuel warning and the presence of a low feed pressure warning is a major clue.
This set of alarms usually indicates that there is a problem in feeding the engine with fuel.
Since the plane's gauges indicated that there was fuel on board that did not get to the engines, ATR's Giuseppe Caldarelli looks for flaws in the fallen plane's fuel delivery system. Four years earlier, an Airbus operated by Air Transat developed a leak in the fuel line that feeds the plane's right engine. Over time, the plane leaked all of its fuel and both engines failed. The pilots were forced to glide their plane to an emergency landing. That incident has a lot of similarities to the Tuninter crash. Giuseppe Caldarelli's team looks for breaks or blockages in the fuel lines and evidence that the fuel pumps malfunctioned and stopped fuel flow to the engines. While Caldarelli waits for technicians to complete tests on pumps and lines, Panetta decides to start a new line of inquiry. He explores the possibility that the fuel that was on board was somehow contaminated.
Fuel contamination can derive from 4 or 5 different sources.
Kerosene-based jet fuel is very delicate. If stored or transferred improperly, it can be polluted with water, sand or fungus, even sticky residue from the hoses of refueling tankers. Any of these could prevent the fuel from properly igniting and could have caused the engines to shut down.
How much fuel are you adding?
400 kilograms.
The plane last took on fuel in Bari. Samples from the tanker that supplied it are taken for testing. Panetta needs to prove that one of these contaminants got into Flight 1153's fuel, prevented combustion, and caused both engines to fail.
Sediments can be transferred from the tanker truck to the aircraft. So the fuel filter can be clogged, and so the engine can have some problem.
Technicians remove the truck's fuel filters to look for evidence of contamination. Hoses and couplings are swabbed for sticky residue or colonies of microorganisms and submitted for testing at an Italian Air Force laboratory. The fuel is filtered for minute particles suspended in the fluid. And carefully examined for impurities. The truck's filters are also inspected for residue or sediment from the tanks. Meanwhile, in Palermo, Caldarelli and his technicians have completed tests on Flight 1153's fuel lines and pumps. The tests are thorough, the results conclusive.
The fuel feed line were okay, were no leak.
If the fuel delivery system was working, and the two pilots remember having ample fuel,
the fuel quantity indicator said 1,800 kilograms of fuel.
Then why had the engines failed? When test results from the Bari fuel tanker come in, they too are conclusive. The fuel filters, hose couplings, and tanker fuel at Bari Airport are clean.
So fuel contamination as a source of double engine flame out was then excluded.
At this point, the investigators still don't know what caused the downing of Tuninter Flight 1153. But something has been eating at Panetta. If the plane was filled with fuel, And since the fuel is stored in the plane's wings, why did the wing section float?
Floating on the wing indicates that the weight of the wing was not so high. We have been told by ATR that if the amount of fuel that was supposed to be into the wing, around 2,000 kilograms, were on the fuel tanks, the wings maybe would have not been able to float.
Panetta suspects the plane didn't have as much fuel as the pilots thought, but he doesn't know how that could be. 2 weeks into the investigation, Panetta gets an important lead in the case.
After 2 weeks of the event, we received some technical documentation from the aircraft operator.
According to the logs, Captain Garbi flew the same aircraft the day before the accident. After that flight, he reported a problem with his fuel gauge.
When he left the aircraft the day before, he reported that the right display float indicator was out of service, so it needed to be replaced.
The fuel quantity indicator, or FQI, is a gas gauge that tells pilots how much fuel is left on board. The lights on the FQI were malfunctioning, and Captain Garbi made a note of this in the maintenance log.
We were able to see that the fuel quantity indicator was changed the day before the event.
The maintenance log raises the possibility that the FQI that the mechanic installed was not the right one for the plane. It doesn't seem to have the right model number. Tuninter flies 2 models of ATR aircraft, the ATR-42 and the larger ATR-72. The fuel quantity indicators for each plane look identical, except for a different model number at the top of each unit. The ATR-72 should have a model number 2500. But according to the logs, mechanics installed a unit with the model number 2250 instead. Tuninter's maintenance logs offer a valuable clue. But for Panetta, there's no definitive proof that the wrong fuel quantity indicator was installed on the plane.
It could have been a mismatch in that aircraft documentation, so we need to prove that.
There is only one way to know for certain whether Flight 1153 had the right fuel quantity indicator. Go find it at the bottom of the sea.
We need, of course, to recover the wreckage from bottom aircraft to physically see what was the fuel quantity indicator installed on the aircraft.
Not until 3 weeks after the crash do investigators recover wreckage from the sea. The data from the plane's black boxes confirms what the pilots have been saying. There was no warning of low fuel, so there appeared to be enough fuel to make the flight. The black boxes can't solve this mystery. Investigators hope that the tail and front section can. They are hauled aboard a naval vessel from the sea. The moment the cockpit is hauled in, Panetta is there. There's only one thing he wants to see inside.
So when the wreckage was recovered from under the sea and put on the ship deck, I realized that, as a matter of fact, the fuel quantity indicator for an ATR-42 was installed. It was like we found the smoking gun.
The wrong FQI was installed on Flight 1153. Panetta finally has the break he's been looking for. The ATR's fuel quantity indicator collects data from sensors in the fuel tanks and calculates how much fuel is in the tanks. But since the fuel tanks on the 42 and the 72 are a different size, fuel quantity indicators can't be swapped between them. Technicians conduct refueling tests with the wrong FQI installed on an ATR-72. And the results are chilling.
The results show that if you install an FQI type, we say 42, on an ATR-72 aircraft, if I have no fuel into the aircraft in the fuel tanks, with it zero fuel, the fuel quantity indicator show me 1,800 kilograms.
Precisely the amount of fuel that the captain reported having when his engines flamed out.
Cockpit fuel quantity 1,800 kilograms.
Investigators conclude, at 23,000 feet above the Mediterranean, the wrong fuel indicator led the crew to believe that they had ample fuel, when their tanks were actually empty.
Engine relight. Negative. They're not doing anything.
The engines could not possibly have been restarted. With hundreds of ATR-42s and ATR-72s still flying, the implications are stark. Could there be other planes flying with the wrong gauge?
The first safety recommendation was to mandate all operators that use ATR-42 and 72 aircraft in their fleet to check whether the right fuel quantity indicator was installed on the aircraft.
Panetta and Caldarelli have uncovered the error that caused both of Flight 1153's engines to quit in mid-air. But the case isn't closed. Standard flight procedures should have uncovered the error before takeoff and prevented the disaster. Captain Garbi's aircraft went in for repairs in Tunisia the night before the crash. The plane's FQI indicated 790 kilograms of fuel in the tank. After the new fuel quantity indicator was installed, it showed that there was almost 4 times as much fuel on board, 3,100 kilograms. The following morning, Captain Garbi noticed that the fuel levels had gone up. He assumed the fuel had been added. But when fuel is added to an aircraft, a refueling slip must be left in the cockpit.
Where is the refueling slip?
The pilot asked to the flight dispatcher where was this refueling slip, but the flight dispatcher was not able to find this refueling slip.
I'll get it to you when you get back from Jerba.
Roger that.
There was no refueling slip because the plane hadn't been refueled. In spite of regulations, the captain left without that vital piece of paper.
There are some standard regulations requiring the pilot to take off only when he is sure about the quantity of fuel.
With the wrong fuel indicator on board and less fuel than he believed, Captain Garbi makes it to Bari, Italy, and tops up his plane for the next leg of the trip to Jerba.
How much fuel are you adding?
400 kilograms.
2,700 total?
Believing he has 2,700 kilograms of fuel on board, Captain Garbi begins his flight to Jerba. If the correct fuel quantity indicator had been installed, the captain would have known that he had only 540 kilograms. Not nearly enough to make the crossing.
Mayday!
Mayday! Mayday! TUI 1153 request immediate landing in Palermo. We've lost both engines.
Panetta's investigation comes to a close. He draws up his final report. His colleague, Giuseppe Caldarelli, voices a bold view. Even with no fuel and dead engines, Flight 1153 could have made it to land.
The aircraft was in a position that allowed to reach Palermo.
TUI 1153.
Caldarelli wonders if the pilots did everything they could have to get the plane safely to Palermo.
TUI 1153.
Investigators get some unexpected answers by having seasoned pilots fly the exact same flight with the exact same problems.
Okay, we are now in big trouble because the second engine has gone off, so...
Vincenzo Panetta's investigation into the crash of Tuninter Flight 1153 has uncovered the events that led up to the accident. Now he and Giuseppe Caldarelli need to resolve one question. Did mistakes made by the pilots cost people their lives?
We're not gonna make it. Prepare to ditch.
Caldarelli and his team study the plane's specifications and draw a surprising conclusion. Flight 1153 could have been able to glide to Palermo. According to manufacturer data, an ATR is able to glide 3 miles for every 1,000 feet of descent. With the help of the tailwind that day, Flight 1153 could have been able to glide 70 miles to Palermo. The crew might have been able to make it.
Landing gear lever up.
So what had the pilots done wrong? To answer that question, Panetta and Caldarelli recreate Flight 1153 in the flight simulator at the ATR facility in France. Test pilots try to glide an ATR-72 for 70 miles from the altitude at which Flight 1153 lost its second engine.
The simulation was requested to see the range of the aircraft starting from the second engine out.
Double engine flame out, you have to be very aware of the configuration of the aircraft in order to keep as much as possible the altitude and distance to fly before the crash.
Stop! Stop. Engine number 1 is flamed out.
With both engines out, the priority is to keep the plane gliding as far as necessary. To do that, pilots can change the angle of their windmilling propellers.
You have the maximum glide performance when you minimize the drag. It's very important to think to feather the propeller in order to reduce the drag.
Feathering the props involves changing their angle against the wind. The maneuver reduces drag.
When you want to feather the propeller in flight, you first have to reduce the power lever to idle and put the condition lever back to feather position.
The crew did not feather their props when their engines quit. The windmilling propellers created enormous drag. If the crew of Flight 1153 had feathered their props, they may have been able to glide further than they did.
Let's get to 17,000 feet.
By the time Captain Garby's second engine flamed out, he was just below 22,000 feet. To further reduce drag at that altitude, the plane should be slowed to 158 miles per hour, the ATR-72's ideal gliding speed. Surprisingly, to glide as far as possible, a pilot doesn't want to fly as fast as possible. The faster a plane flies, the more the airflow pushes against it, creating resistance. Every plane has an optimal speed to achieve the furthest glide. The crew continued flying up to 55 miles an hour faster than their optimal gliding speed. That added to the drag on the plane and reduced the distance they could glide. By feathering his props and reducing his speed, a simulator pilot in France was able to get the plane as far as Palermo.
You with me, Ellie? Huh? Careful.
Flight 1153 hit the water 26 miles from shore, well short of what the plane was capable of achieving. The simulation confirmed that the crew might have been able to make it to land.
It was theoretically possible to reach the coast, but it was also very difficult to achieve that result.
Simulator pilots had one big advantage over the crew of Flight 1153. They weren't in a life or death situation, and they knew they had to glide instead.
Fuel supply, check.
But Captain Garby didn't know he was out of fuel. He didn't think he'd need to glide to Palermo. Garby focused on restarting the engines instead. Feathering the props isn't part of that procedure. If the captain had known he was out of fuel, he might have acted to maximize glide instead. Once he realized that his engines wouldn't start, his focus was on trying to find a place to ditch the plane. Captain Garbi also had to contend with a lack of instruments, as well as radio interruptions.
TUI 1153. What is your fuel load?
Cockpit fuel quantity 1,800 kilograms.
Most importantly, Captain Garbi had the lives of his 34 passengers to consider.
Of course, it's much easier to cope with that kind of situation on the simulator, because if you do wrong, if you crash the aircraft, you have the magic button, right, reset, everything is okay again. And that's very different in the real life with passengers behind and when it's your life.
Your distance is now 20 miles.
We're not going to make it.
The simulation highlights the importance of proper training to deal with unlikely situations, such as a twin-engine flameout.
In aviation, it's a very rare event.
Vincenzo Panetta's report urges airlines to train their pilots how to ditch without engine power. Better pilot training is just one of 17 safety recommendations in the accident report. Perhaps the most important, that ATR redesigned the fuel quantity indicator.
In order to prevent a fuel quantity indicator type 42 on a 72 aircraft and vice versa.
To prevent mechanics from installing the incorrect part, Panetta believes that the only answer is to design the FQIs so that they only fit on the plane they're meant for. 9 men face charges of criminal negligence for the downing of Flight 1153, including the Tuninter mechanic who installed the wrong FQI, and Captain Garbi.
I'll get it to you when you get back from Jerba.
Roger that.
There is no single cause of the accident. This accident, like many other aircraft accidents, was determined by a series of action, a series of events linked one to each other.
È inaudita una cosa del genere.
This is unheard of.
Avrei accettato di più se si fosse rotto un motore.
I would have accepted the engine breaking or a window shattering. But to have people die because of a lack of fuel?
Persone perché manca di carburante su un aereo.
Per evitare che si possano ripetere altre tragedie.
We remember this to avoid such other tragedies, so that when you board a plane, you don't have to endure anything, not even the simplest things.
Semplici, perché sono quelle cose più semplici che si potrebbero evitare.
Because it is the simple things that can be avoided. Tragic events like this should not happen.
Dei disastri così gravi.
Attempt to restart the engine.
The crash of Flight 1153 was caused by a series of grave errors on the ground and in the air. But the flight data recorder does show that the crew's last move before hitting the water was absolutely perfect.
Here we go.
According to the available evidences, the flight data recorder and also some statement released by the crew that survived, the aircraft touched the sea first with the rear part of the aircraft at an altitude which is compatible with the optimum pitch altitude of the aircraft, which is 9 degrees.
Captain Garbi raised the plane's nose up to 9 degrees at the last possible moment. So instead of plowing into the sea, his plane glided along the surface of the water. The maneuver likely saved lives by allowing more passengers to escape the ruined aircraft. His flying may have prevented this accident from becoming an even greater tragedy.
Where's Adam direct to? My God, he's flying north.
A Boeing 737 is badly off course.
Adam 574, confirm our position, please.
The crew struggles to get the plane back on track.
This is crazy!
They're lost in a violent storm. when their plane starts rolling over.
Pull up! Pull up!
The lives of 102 people are at risk.
Adam 574, Yuzhong control.
Then, mysteriously, Adam Air Flight 574 disappears without a trace. January the 1st, 2007, Surabaya, Indonesia. It's New Year's Day. There are celebrations throughout the country. Surabaya's airport is bustling. And not just because of the holidays. Indonesia is experiencing a boom of budget airlines. Many people are taking advantage of the cheaper fares.
For the average Indonesian, it meant that the explosion of low-cost carriers made it much more possible to actually get on a plane and fly.
One of those new airlines is Adam Air.
Good afternoon, departure. This is Adam 574.
Adam 574, this is ground control. Go ahead.
Adam Air was successful because it provided a fresh image to the industry. I mean, they came in with, bright colors. The airplanes were painted in fantastic orange. The crew was in a flashy uniform. They had everything right going for them.
Captain Refri Widodo has been flying with Adam Air for 6 months. Today, he's in command of Flight 574, a short domestic flight. His co-pilot, Yoga Susanto, has been with the airline for almost a year and a half. Before the discount travel boom, many passengers wouldn't have been able to afford this flight.
More and more people were able to fly, could afford the tickets, and they didn't care too much about the services offered simply because they just were intent on getting from point A to point B as cheaply as possible.
There are 96 passengers and 6 crew members on today's flight. Controllers at the airport are busy juggling planes.
Okay, the 574 is clear for takeoff.
80 knots. Check. V1. Rotate.
Today's flight is a routine 2-hour hop. From Surabaya on the island of Java to Manado on the island of Sulawesi, almost 1,700 kilometers northeast. It's the beginning of the rainy season. Weather is unpredictable. Forecasters are expecting fierce storms. Captain Widodo is aware that there may be bad weather ahead.
Turn right direct to Fando and climb to flight level 330.
Roger, turn right direct to Fando and climb to flight level 330, Adam 574.
Minutes after takeoff, the crew turns on the autopilot. The flight computer will fly the plane and navigate it along a pre-planned route to Manado.
now passing flight level 220, climbing to flight level 330.
Roger, Adam 574, track direct to Diola.
Confirmed.
Tracking direct to Diola, Adam 574.
22,000 feet below, air traffic controllers track the flight's progress on radar and confirm that it's on course. The plane is beginning to experience some turbulence. Less than half an hour into the flight, air traffic controllers notice something out of the ordinary.
Where's Adam direct to? My God, he's flying north.
Flight 574 has flown off course and is now heading into a violent storm. Air traffic controllers don't know why.
Yes.
On board the plane, the pilots try to understand how far they have drifted off course.
The IRS. 28 is the difference.
And try to fix the problem with the computerized system that handles navigation.
May I have your attention? This is your captain speaking. We are about to experience some turbulence. Could all the passengers return to their seats?
Controllers on the ground try to get Flight 574 back on course, giving them directions to their next assigned waypoint called Diola.
Adam Air 574, maintain 350, direct to Diola.
Confirm flight level 350, direct to Diola, Adam 574.
But to get there, Flight 574 must pass through a severe storm. 137-kilometer-an-hour winds beat on the plane's hull. It's pounded by hail and rain. The weather is making it hard to see. The crew is not just concerned with the weather. They're still also trying to understand the problem with the plane's navigation system.
This is messed up.
Getting lost over the ocean is everyone's worry, because when you lose your navigational instruments or you lose trust of your navigation instruments, what do?
Co-pilot Susanto consults the aircraft's handbook.
It's starting to fly like a bamboo ship.
Captain Widodo doesn't know where he is. He needs directions.
Confirm our position. Adam 574, confirm our position, please.
Roger, Adam 574, position is 125 miles. Mike, Kilo Sierra, crossing radial 307. Mike, Kilo Sierra.
The weather in Mike Kilo Sierra isn't good.
The storm is growing worse.
This is crazy. We're going to get lost if it stays like this.
Captain Widodo wants to take over navigation of the plane from the flight computer.
Okay, put the IRS in attitude.
But suddenly, a warning. The autopilot has disengaged completely. Then many of Susanto's computerized instruments go blank. The crew doesn't notice that their plane is rolling over. Flight 574 is banking at a dangerous angle.
To enter this.
Bank angle. Bank angle. Bank angle.
If it rolls too far over, it could send the plane and the 102 people on board into a fatal downward spiral.
Okay, put it back on nav again. Put it back on nav again. Put it on nav again.
Captain Widodo wants to re-engage the flight computer's navigation system. The The plane is still rolling, and now its nose has started to point downward. Another alarm tells the pilots that they are entering a steep descent.
Don't turn it! This is our heading!
Adam 574, Yujun control. Adam 574, Yujun control. Adam 574, radar service terminated. Please contact Yujun control at 128.1.
Inexplicably, Flight 574 has disappeared. News of Adam Air Flight 574's disappearance spreads quickly. The Indonesian government starts mobilizing search and rescue teams to find it. First Air Marshal Edi Suyanto will coordinate the search and rescue.
Pada tanggal 1 Januari 2007.
On the 1st of January 2007, I received a verbal notification from the Vice Assistant Operation Head of Air Force that Adam Air had not landed in Manado.
Belum mendarat di Manado.
Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, or NTSC, is also notified. The NTSC is responsible for finding out what went wrong in any plane crash. Franz Wieners is in charge of investigating Adam Air 574.
The first steps that we take when there was an accident or serious incident, we will find all the resources that we have and get the team together before we dispatch to the area.
Working with air traffic control, the searchers try to pinpoint the last recorded location of Flight 574.
Mendapatkan laporan juga bahwa
I received the report that Adam Air was lost from the radar in the Majin Sea.
Laut Majeni.
The plane was last detected by radar as it was crossing the sea, about halfway through its intended journey.
Okay, so right around here.
But the plane could have flown hundreds of kilometers after that signal was received. It's impossible to pinpoint the exact location.
When the aircraft went missing, it was a bit of a shock for everybody because in this day and age, nobody expects an aircraft to go missing.
Without a specific location, searchers try to figure out how large an area to scan. Since they know how much fuel was on board, investigators can calculate how far the plane could have flown since it was last detected.
If this is their last radar hit, they didn't have enough fuel to fly any further than this.
More than 3,000 people are sent out to look for the plane. The Indonesians are joined by a US Navy vessel. But the area they have to search is the size of Ireland. The teams don't even know whether to look on land or on water.
And as long as there was no definitive word, hope remained.
12 hours pass without any confirmed sightings. And then friends and relatives' hopes are raised with news that survivors have been found.
A new report came in saying that they had found the Adam Air wreckage in the mountainous area of Polowali, with 100 victims and 12 survivors still alive.
Rescue teams hurry to the island of Sulawesi, hoping to return survivors to their families. They also hope to discover what went wrong on board the plane.
When news broke that some people might have survived the crash, the already incredibly stressed and emotional families of the survivors thought, whoa, maybe there is a chance. Maybe my wife, cousin, husband, brother has survived.
But when the first officials get there, they find that these survivors are not from the flight at all.
So they were ferry survivors, not airplane survivors.
They're from a ship that sank in another storm near where Flight 574 is thought to have crashed. Now the rescue teams are back to square one.
It led people's hopes up. And people flocked to Makassar and they were finding ways how to get to the crash site, only to find that it's not there.
For family members, it's a bitter disappointment.
Sebetulnya kita malu.
We were ashamed because the information was already spread all over before we verified it. Our government was embarrassed that we publicized that information. It's been a week since the crash. With each passing day, the chance of finding any survivors grows smaller.
There was still no clear picture of exactly where the plane had crashed and how it had gone down and why it had gone down.
Venus needs to locate the wreckage as soon as possible. Most of all, he needs the 2 black boxes that record conversations in the cockpit and flight data. There are beacons attached to the boxes, but they only have a 30-day battery life. 9 days after the crash of Adam Air Flight 574, a fisherman finds what he thinks might be part of an airplane, 300 meters off the coast of Sulawesi. The piece is taken to an Indonesian Air Force base for analysis. Franz Venus quickly identifies that it is part of a Wright elevator. He examines it to see if it belongs to Adam Air Flight 574.
We checked with the serial numbers, we checked with the part numbers.
The numbers match.
So we are definitely sure that it is from the aircraft.
The finding confirms that Flight 574 crashed at sea. The team can now narrow down its search to the area where the elevator was found. Since the accident involves an American-made plane, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board joins the investigation. And they send structural engineer Clint Cruikshanks to Indonesia.
We started working with the NTSC to look at radar data, air traffic transmissions, weather data, trying to bring all that information together to find the airplane.
The water that investigators plan to search for wreckage is 6,500 feet deep, much too deep to send down divers.
It was quite deep water, deeper than we're normally used to recovering airplanes from.
The Indonesian government wants Adam Air to pay for the salvage operation. Investigators meet with representatives of the airline.
It is going to be expensive. We need to hire contractors to go down that far.
Adam Air felt that its responsibility only went so far. The government and most of public opinion believed that Adam Air's responsibility was actually almost total because they were the owners of the airline.
The airline refuses to pay for the salvage, triggering a lengthy negotiation. This is not good news for Franz Venus. Unless someone puts up the money to search the seabed for wreckage, the mystery of Flight 574 will not be solved. It is also a blow to the families of the victims.
The families obviously wanted to know what had happened to their loved ones, and they did want the government and Adam Air to combine to get the flight data recorders out of the water.
As the investigation stalls, public anger grows.
People were becoming more and more critical of Adam Air and the way it was being run.
But then, after 7 months of negotiating,
this is good news. Thank you.
Adam Air agrees to help pay for the salvage. Phoenix International, an American company specializing in deepwater salvage, starts the operation on August the 24th. But the time they've lost has had a serious consequence. Although they have a fix on the location of the crash, the locator beacons attached to the black boxes have gone dead.
If the black boxes are not found, it will be a mystery until today.
Without the beacon, finding two small boxes among the wreckage will be a huge challenge. To make matters worse, Adam Air has only put up enough money for 1 week of searching.
So it was like, go out there, if you don't find anything in 7 days, you're done.
After locating debris with sonar, an unmanned remote-controlled submarine is sent down to look for the black boxes.
All right, how are we doing? We dove on one location first. We got to that GPS location. There was nothing there.
Pull up quadrant 3.
So we sat down and decided we'd do a grid search about that point, and so we did a very methodical search.
Okay, 3 degrees. All right. Slow, slow. We're coming up on something.
We started picking up small, lightweight pieces of airplane wreckage. Things like life vests, seat trays, light bits of metal.
Oh my God, this is it.
Investigators get their first look at the wreckage.
This plane is ripped apart.
The state of the wreckage illustrates just how violent this plane crash was.
The little pieces of wreckage didn't tell us anything about the cause of the crash. They did tell us, however, that the airplane hit the water at a very high rate of speed. This was the most fragmented airplane that I have ever seen.
Only 2 days into the operation, Cruikshank spots something.
All right, stop. Rotate back 5 degrees.
I noticed on the left side of the video screen something that appeared to be orange, and I instructed the ROV operator to take a closer look at it.
That's it. That's it. Okay.
Once we got over there, we realized that, yeah, this in fact was the FDR.
The plane's flight data recorder has been found.
All right, good work, Joe. Let's get this up.
We were very excited that we had seen and recovered one of the boxes.
Investigators soon find the cockpit voice recorder nearby.
All right, stop. That's it.
Their week is up. The salvage operation is over. Investigators now hope that they have all the clues they need to solve this accident.
The black boxes is the only source for the evidence that we have, because we don't have the wreckage, we don't have the witnesses.
But the boxes have been lying on the bottom of the sea for almost 8 months. They could be damaged beyond repair. They may not yield any information at all. The black boxes from Adam Air Flight 574 are taken to the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C. Investigators think the labs there are the best bet at salvaging any possible information.
If an FDR is found in salt water, it needs to be washed in fresh water and then contained in water the entire time until it makes it to our lab.
Salt and air together create a chemical reaction that results in rust. The rust can damage the electronic components in the recorders. Keeping them submerged in fresh water delays that reaction.
The importance of having the data depends on the circumstances of the accident. If you're able to recover wreckage in other parts to investigate, then you don't necessarily need to rely on the data. For this particular accident, since the wreckage was going to stay at the bottom of the ocean, it was essential that we had data from the recorders.
Franz Wieners also makes the trip to the United States.
The FDR and the CPR, when they were recovered from the bottom of the sea, the cases were actually 50 or 60% damage.
We thought there might be an issue in recovering the data. It wasn't as damaged as many others we've seen, so we were fairly confident if there was data recorded, we would be able to get the data off of it.
Technicians begin the painstaking process of retrieving the information. The job is a multinational effort.
The Australian Transport Safety Bureau was requested to assist. We have an excellent relationship with the NTSB folk, and so our flight recorder specialist went to the United States and worked alongside the NTSB.
The electronic components containing the data are carefully removed and dried. Then the information is uploaded onto a computer. As the delicate procedure of recovering the data from both recorders progresses, investigators are aware that they have an additional concern.
As you can tell,
one problem that we ran up against in this investigation is the maintenance records indicated that the flight data recorder was written up as being inoperable in the weeks prior to the crash. We were concerned with that in that if we found the FDR, it may not have recorded anything.
Investigators keep their fingers crossed.
we've got it all. It's all there.
I was confident once we found out that we had 100% of the data that we would be able to solve this accident.
The two black boxes provide investigators with the first solid clues about why Flight 574 fell from the sky.
Good afternoon, departure. This is Adam 574. Now passing flight level 220, climbing to flight level 330.
Roger, Adam 574. Track direct to Diola.
Confirmed. Tracking direct to Diola, Adam 574.
The conversation in the cockpit tells investigators that the crew knew that the plane's navigation system was sending them off course.
The IRS.
28 is the difference.
They're drifting.
And that they were preoccupied with fixing that problem.
This is messed up.
Where's Adam direct to? My God, he's flying north. Adam Air 574, maintain 350, direct to Diola.
Confirmed. Flight level 350, direct to Diola, Adam 574.
To get from one waypoint to the next, the flight computer always has to know the plane's exact location. That information comes from a component called the IRS, or Inertial Reference System. It tracks every adjustment to the plane's course to calculate its exact position. It then feeds that information to the autopilot.
The autopilot needs to know where the aircraft is and where it needs to go. Now, the autopilot takes those data from the IRS in terms of height, heading, and speed.
But for the system to keep track of the plane's heading, it has to know where the plane started. The IRS has to be calibrated before takeoff. Usually, the crew will enter the coordinates of the gate as the starting point for the computer to track. Investigators wonder if the IRS guided the plane off course because the wrong initial coordinates were entered.
Franz, we just got this.
They check this by looking at information from the flight data recorder.
The numbers are fine when they're on the ground.
Yes.
The data confirms the IRS was calibrated before Adam Air Flight 574 took off.
This is where it begins.
But for some reason, the IRS began to send the plane off course almost as soon as the flight got in the air.
It just gets worse and worse.
I have something else I'd like to show you. Some maintenance logs.
Cruikshanks and Wieners look at the maintenance history of the IRS system that was on board Flight 574.
As you can tell, there's more than 100 write-ups here. Look at this.
Same unit. Same problem.
That's right.
The history shows that there had been numerous complaints about the plane's navigation system over the past 3 months.
Again and again.
Investigators wonder why the airline didn't fix the problem.
In the case of the IRS of this aircraft, that unit should have been taken out and sent to maintenance for calibration or repairs.
Investigators discover that when pilots complained about a faulty IRS unit, the airline didn't fix it properly. They would either swap it with a unit from another plane, or often they would only do a basic cleaning of the malfunctioning unit.
They just pull up the connectors, spray it with some lubricant cleaners, then put it back on, did some ground test, and then just put ground test OK on the maintenance log.
Since the IRS is such a vital piece of equipment, this is contrary to all recommended repair policies. Investigators listen to the cockpit voice recorder, hoping to discover how the malfunctioning IRS contributed to the crash.
This is crazy! We're going to get lost if it stays like this.
Don't turn it! This is our heading! Pull up! Pull up!
But nothing they hear leads them to believe that an IRS malfunction alone could have caused the plane to crash.
If you have a failure in one system of the airplane, it shouldn't cause an accident.
Investigators now wonder if the severe storm Flight 574 flew into somehow played a role in this crash.
This is messed up. This is really messed up. It's starting to fly like a bamboo ship. Confirm our position.
Weather is a well-known cause of airline accidents. It can wreak havoc with the airplane and disorient pilots. In 1977, a Southern Airways DC-9 flew into a violent storm near New Hope, Georgia.
Our left engine just cut out.
Hail clogged the engines. They tore themselves apart.
Got the other engine going too.
Brace for impact!
The plane slammed into the small town, and 72 people were killed. In order to determine if weather was a factor in the Adam Air crash, investigators need a more complete picture of what happened on board the flight. They want to know everything the crew did and said from the time they discovered that they were off course to the time they hit the water. To do this, they combine the data from the two black boxes to create a computer simulation of the flight.
That gives us very close to the possibility of what really happened with the aircraft.
Investigators return to Jakarta to study the simulation.
The weather in Mike Sierras isn't good.
This is crazy! We're going to get lost if it stays like this.
They can see that throughout most of the flight, the computer was navigating the plane. But since the flight computer was sending the plane off course, the captain decided to navigate the plane himself.
Okay, put the IRS in attitude.
Co-pilot Susanto switched the navigation system to a mode that would keep the plane flying straight and level. Captain Widodo could now change his course.
This is where they switch from nav to attitude.
Switching from one mode to the other forces some computerized gauges to temporarily go blank while they reset. One is the ADI, or Artificial Horizon, which tells the crew if the plane is flying level.
ADI goes off and stays off.
There was also another much more serious consequence to the switch.
That's where the plane starts its right roll.
The autopilot disengaged when they consciously selected from the nav mode to the attitude mode, and then the aircraft commenced an almost imperceptible roll to the right of around about 1 degree per second.
The captain missed a crucial step when he switched his flight computer from one mode to the other.
Quick reference handbook, please.
He should have flown his plane straight and level while the computer adjusted to the new setting.
Maintain straight and level, constant airspeed flight until attitude displays recover. Approximately 30 seconds. It's in the manual.
Any pilot who is trained and qualified on the Boeing 737-400 is regarded to have a sufficient knowledge that whenever they switch the nav mode to attitude, they have to maintain wings level for 30 seconds.
But neither of the pilots did that. It's an oversight with grave consequences. Without that step, the autopilot disengages completely. The flight computer did send out a warning when that happened, but the warning was ignored. The crew didn't seem to notice that the autopilot was no longer flying the plane. And it only took seconds for that to become a very serious problem. The data tells investigators that this plane had a natural tendency to roll to the right. Old planes, like old cars, don't always go straight. Throughout the flight, the autopilot compensated for that by raising the aileron on the plane's left wing. An aileron is a movable flap on the wing that controls how much the plane rolls to the left and right. But once the autopilot disengaged, it stopped compensating and the ailerons went back to a neutral position. That allowed the plane to revert to its tendency to roll to the right.
And they don't even notice.
At this point, the plane was rolling at a rate of 1 degree per second. Focused on their faulty navigation system, and with thick clouds obscuring the horizon, the pilots had no idea that their plane was dipping. It's not uncommon for pilots to get disoriented in this way.
Your body will start to fool you. Your senses will start sending you false information or false senses. You might think that you are actually going straight and level, while you're actually rolling slowly to the right or to the left.
The 737 is programmed to issue a warning when it rolls past 35 degrees.
Bank angle, bank angle, bank angle.
The flight data recorder shows investigators that in response to that alert, Captain Widodo did attempt to level the plane.
They get an oral warning from the airplane that says, hey, bank angle, bank angle. And at that point, they made some small inputs to the controls, but they didn't fly the airplane.
Believing that the autopilot would keep the plane level, Widodo soon turned his attention back to the problematic IRS.
When the pilot engrossed with troubleshooting of the IRS, their ability to pay attention for the other tasks is reduced. Further, this IRS anomalies has become the only priority at the moment.
Usually you would say one pilot deals with the system issue, the other pilot flies the airplane. They were both dealing with this system issue and totally focused on the issue, so they never saw what was happening.
This is not the first accident involving what we would call spatial disorientation.
It was almost 3 years earlier to the day that another flight, Flash Airlines 604, taking off over the Red Sea, had a similar fate.
See what the aircraft just did?
Distracted by a malfunctioning component in the cockpit, the captain may have become disoriented.
Autopilot! Autopilot!
Like the Adam Air flight, the captain's attention was focused on his flight computer. And like the Adam Air flight, his plane began rolling dangerously to the right. Investigators concluded that without any external references, the captain simply couldn't tell that his plane was falling from the sky.
Tragically, just because there is an initial reference system failure, or let's say in another accident there might be an engine failure, does not mean that an aircraft has to crash.
It's 60 degrees now and there's no attempt at a recovery.
Don't turn it! This is our heading! Pull up! Pull up!
Investigators can see that when Captain Widodo does take action, he makes the situation much worse. With his plane still banked drastically to the right, Captain Widodo should have leveled his wings and then pulled his nose up. He did the opposite. He began pulling back on his control column before his wings were level. That forced the plane into a tight spiral dive.
Basically, it rolled, and it just kept rolling until it almost went inverted and just fell, kind of fell out of the sky once it got to a point where it wasn't flying like a normal airplane should.
The aircraft was descending at nearly 900 kilometres an hour, at a vertical speed at times reaching in excess of 21,000 feet per minute.
That's almost the speed of sound, and more than 150 kilometers an hour faster than this plane was designed to withstand.
It's rolling over rapid descent. They can't recover now.
At that speed, the plane is no longer able to hold itself together.
And that sound. That's the sound of the plane coming apart.
The black boxes have revealed how Flight 574 crashed. But they also raise crucial questions.
It's just one error after another.
There was ample opportunity, ample time for the pilots to correct the situation.
The investigators have come to a disturbing conclusion. The only mechanical failure was with the plane's navigation system. And that shouldn't have caused the crash. The more significant failures were human.
Okay, put the IRS in attitude.
But why should qualified pilots make these disastrous mistakes?
Don't turn it! This is our heading!
To find these answers, investigators must look at the airline itself. This one accident will raise serious questions about Indonesia's entire aviation industry. Investigators turn their attention from the actions of the pilots on Flight 574 to the airline that employed them, Adam Air. They meet with the owners.
Franz Wings.
Adam Air was founded in 2002 by a wealthy businesswoman named Sandra Ang. Ang named the airline after her son, Adam, whom she also appointed as the company's president.
We need to know more about your training program.
The investigators interview Adam Air pilots.
Did the airline provide any training on recovery procedures in the event of an IRS failure? No.
They want to find out more about how the airline trained its flight crews.
What about recovery techniques? IRS troubleshooting? No?
What they uncover is disturbing.
We could not find any evidence that the pilot was properly trained when they have a sudden disengaging autopilot or when they're flying with the iris failure.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time.
As they dig deeper, investigators find an airline plagued with safety issues. 11 months before the Adam Air crash, in February 2006, another Adam Air plane, Flight 782, flew off course the same way as Flight 574. That crew was also getting faulty navigation data. But they couldn't even reach controllers on the radio. They couldn't get directions. They were badly lost for 3 hours.
The crew was trying to find where they were. The ATC was trying to find where they were. And they were over the water.
Like Flight 574, they had a malfunctioning IRS. In the end, the plane landed almost 500 kilometers south of where it should have been.
They just continued until they found an island. And it had an airport in it. They said, okay, we have to land there, otherwise we don't know where we're going to go. And they landed, and they didn't know exactly where they were until they landed.
6 months after Flight 574, the European Commission banned all Indonesian airlines from flying to Europe.
That sent a very strong message to the whole world that we, the European Union, believe that all Indonesian airlines are unsafe and you should not fly on them.
Then in March 2008, there's another accident involving Adam Air, this time in the city of Batam.
And the airplane slewed off the runway, came to rest on the side. The evacuation was a bit strange. Nose lights were deployed, and that was a final accident. And after that, I think everybody said, enough's enough, you know.
People who did care, people who were wanting to shake up the industry and reform it and improve it, were horrified that the situation had been so bad within Adam Air and that the authorities had allowed such a situation to continue and deteriorate.
Immediately after the crash in Batam, the Indonesian government suspended and then ultimately revoked Adam Air's license to operate. It is also apparent that Adam Air isn't the only Indonesian airline with problems.
Prior to the Adam Air crash, Indonesia experienced a bad crash about every year to 18 months.
Many of those accidents involved the discount carriers that the government had allowed to thrive. More than 50 such airlines were in operation at the time of the Adam Air crash.
The problem, though, was that this expansion occurred in a way that was not properly monitored, not properly regulated by the government. Thousands and thousands of people are being employed to work for airlines when they just don't have the experience to do so and are not being adequately trained, as the investigation report into the Adam Air crash demonstrated.
Indonesia's poor safety record forces the government to take steps to improve airline safety throughout the country. It begins rating airlines on safety and grounds those that don't comply. There have been fewer fatal incidents since the reforms. But a year and a half after it was put in place, the European Union's ban on Indonesian airlines was still in effect. Those familiar with Indonesian aviation think the reforms could go even further.
So that we have no more Adam Airs, we have no more companies that cut costs too much and gives all these extra risks to the public, because that's not what the public should receive. The public should receive a reliable and safe means of air transportation.
Halloween, 1994.
You haven't heard any more from this controller chick, huh?
No, not a word.
commuter plane circles outside Chicago, waiting for clearance to land.
Eagle Flight 184, descend and maintain 8,000.
8,000, Eagle 184.
Without warning, the controls snap to the right. The plane plunges straight for the ground. The behavior of the crew and the air traffic controllers would be examined. Pilots would question the safety of an airplane.
The airplane will have a nasty tendency to go out of control.
Investigators travel the world for answers. The crash makes Roselawn one of aviation's darkest words.
Mayday.
It's mid-afternoon on October the 31st, 1994. American Eagle Flight 4184 left Indianapolis, Indiana 15 minutes ago. It's heading to Chicago. There are 68 passengers and crew on board.
Happy Halloween, cowboy.
Flying through the clouds, the aircraft begins to experience some turbulence.
I'm gonna keep them in their seats in this chop and sense them taking chances.
Captain Orlando Aguiar is in command of today's flight. It's supposed to be his day off. He volunteered for this flight to make extra money. His wife is expecting their second child.
See if we can get above this. Center, any chance Flight 184 can climb to 16,000?
First Officer Jeff Gagliano is handling the flying duties on this leg of the flight. He programs the autopilot to climb to a less turbulent altitude.
Jeff actually was working on his dad's ranch in Wisconsin just before he came in for that trip on Halloween that day. Getting on a horse or getting in an airplane, those were two of the things that Jeff loved most.
Flight 4184 is an ATR-72, a groundbreaking new aircraft built in France. Cost-efficient and comfortable, the plane has become popular on short runs. This flight is just one of 5 short hops the crew will be making today. It's Amanda Holberg's first day on the job as a flight attendant with American Eagle. She's paired with Sandy Modaf, a seasoned veteran. Aguiar and Gagliano have flown this route countless times and know it by heart.
When you're flying from Indianapolis to Chicago, you're flying through some of the busiest airspace in the world.
As Flight 4184 approaches Chicago O'Hare, the pilots begin the descent to 10,000 feet.
Chicago Center, we have discretion down to 10,000. We're on our way down now.
In Chicago, controller Michelle Willman is returning from a break. The trainee controller is still working under the supervision of a monitor. She's told that traffic into O'Hare is facing potential delays because of weather. She will have to be prepared to put some flights on hold.
Operations into and out of O'Hare are handled on a priority basis. It's not necessarily a first-come, first-served basis. International flights arriving to O'Hare because of their fuel status get priority, and then the turboprops come in at the end.
Eagle 184, hold southeast on Victor 7.
Chicago Center, roger. Hold southeast on Victor 7. Eagle 184.
Flight 4184 must now fly a racetrack-shaped holding pattern over northwestern Indiana.
Chicago Center, Eagle 184, entering the hold.
Eagle 184, roger.
Aguiar programs the autopilot to keep the plane circling at 10,000 feet.
I'll go up front, see if they want anything.
The crew has little to do as they wait for air traffic controllers to give them permission to land.
Can I get you boys anything?
I'm good.
Stereo? Oh, you don't have a hard job.
We do have it pretty easy. This thing gets a real high deck angle in these turns. Yeah. We're just wallowing in the air right now. You want flaps 15? We'll bring the nose down. Sure. I guess Sandy's going woo now.
See y'all.
All right.
The crew needs to let the airline know about their delay. It could affect the rest of the day's schedule. Crews use text messages to communicate with dispatchers, so they don't tie up radio frequencies.
Shall I let them know how much fuel we got? Sure. Space, F-U-E-L, is that?
We've got 3,600 pounds. Well, folks, once again, this is the captain. I do regret to inform you that air traffic control has put us into a holding pattern up here. We're holding for approximately 20 minutes out of Chicago at this time. I do apologize for all the delays.
That's much nicer. Around flaps 15.
Shit, once they let us out of the hold and forget they're down, we'll get the overspeed warning. I can't hold anymore, man.
We got plenty of gas. We could be up here for a long while.
Hey, bro.
Yeah.
I'm getting busy with the ladies back here.
Oh.
Yeah, so if I don't make it up there, say the next
15, 20 minutes, you know why.
Okay, when we get closer
To the touchdown, I'll give you a ring.
Oh, no, I'll be up right now.
You haven't heard any more from this controller chick, huh?
No, not a word.
Eagle Flight 184, descend and maintain 8,000.
Down 8,000, Eagle 184.
Eagle Flight 184, should be about 10 minutes till you're cleared in.
Thank you.
The flight is allowed to descend.
Are we out of the hole?
No, just going down to 8,000.
Then a warning.
I knew we'd do that.
The plane is going too fast to fly with its flaps extended.
I was trying to keep it at 180.
Gagliano retracts the flaps. There's a strange sound coming through the fuselage. Suddenly, the control column turns sharply to the right. The controls won't budge. The plane is falling from the sky. The pilots begin to recover control. But then it happens again.
It was coming down too steep to even try to land. It was coming down at a sharp angle, a real sharp angle.
Flight 4184 has crashed into a field just outside Roselawn, Indiana.
Oh my God, they're dead. They have to be. For the speed that it was coming down at.
Hundreds of volunteers arrive at the crash site to offer help, but there's nothing they can do.
There was not much to see of any airplane. You couldn't see no cabin or anything of the airplane. There just wasn't anything left of it.
Both pilots, the 2 flight attendants, and all 64 passengers are dead. The Roselawn crash would soon become one of the most important accidents in aviation history. It will lead investigators to new conclusions about a string of older crashes. The morning after the crash of American Eagle Flight 4184, a team from the National Transportation Safety Board is on the scene just outside Roselawn, Indiana. Greg Fife is the lead investigator.
The morning that we arrived at the accident site, it was cold, it was overcast, it was one of those drizzly, dank days. All you could smell was the Jet A or the kerosene fuel, and because it was muddy and wet, you had that odor or that aroma of dirt. And so with all of those smells, that really evokes some emotion there. And now you have to walk through that field and actually start to do your job.
The crash site is soaked in jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. Human remains are scattered everywhere. The site is declared a biohazard.
With 4184 was one of those types of accidents where there was very little left of the airplane.
Investigators know that the way the wreckage is spread out can tell them how the plane hit the ground.
Because there was a fan-shaped debris pattern and it was spread out over a very large area, we knew that the impact was very shallow, but at a very high speed.
The airplane's 2 flight recorders are found intact in the tail. They're taken to the NTSB's labs for analysis. The data on the recorders could provide the clues investigators need to solve the mystery. But extracting the data takes time. In the meantime, investigators look for the location of key pieces of wreckage.
The first things we typically look for are the 4 corners of the airplane.
The NTSB's Bob Swaim leads that search.
You're looking for the nose and the tail and the 2 wingtips, because if you can tell where the 4 corners of the airplane are, you get an initial idea of whether the pilot was in control or not.
The plane's 4 corners are far from each other. The nose and cockpit are completely destroyed. This tells investigators that the plane hit the ground nose first in a shallow but rapid descent. The fact that the plane wasn't in a steep descent on impact indicates that the pilots had some control in the final seconds before the crash. They just ran out of room to pull up. Investigator Bob Swaim, meanwhile, has recovered some of the plane's instruments, including its attitude director indicator, also known as the artificial horizon. It's a key instrument that tells pilots if they're flying level. If it malfunctioned, it could have misled the crew and caused them to make mistakes.
We had a pretty good idea of the attitude of the airplane at impact, so it would really help at that point to see if the pilots had the same view of the flight that we found as they hit the ground.
Hit the lights for me, please.
A lot of the cockpit pieces use a fluorescent paint or something similar, and when they contact each other, little bits of the paint transfer. If we look at those with a black light, we can see things that the naked eye cannot see.
There's a good imprint here.
The force of the impact has left tiny scratches on the shattered instrument. Swaim discovers that the attitude indicator seems to have been working. Its final readings show the plane was leveling off. The instrument coincides with the plane's actual position on impact.
It indicated that at least the flight instruments that the pilots would have been looking at were appropriate, they were proper, that the pilots had something to fly by.
The discovery means that the pilots knew their plane was diving towards the ground. Investigator Greg Fife is getting a clearer picture of the flight's final seconds. Now he wants to know about the history of this flight before it fell from the sky.
One of the elements of the investigation, of course, was to look at air traffic control.
Eagle 184 holds southeast on...
Fife learns that Flight 4184 had been in a holding pattern southeast of Chicago for 39 minutes before the crash.
When we looked at the air traffic control records, we found that the flow rate, that is, the number of airplanes that were going into Chicago O'Hare at the time, had to be reduced because of the weather moving through the area.
Well, folks, I do regret to inform you that air traffic control has put us into a holding pattern up here.
And because of the reduced rate into Chicago, we knew that 4184 was going to have to hold for a very long period of time.
I do apologize for all the delays.
One of the aspects that we found was that one of the controllers in the facility was relatively new. They were considered a trainee.
Had an inexperienced controller put Flight 4184 in peril? Chief Investigator Greg Fife wants to know more about the weather conditions along the holding pattern.
I want weather data, pilot reports, its atmospheric conditions, its Doppler radar, anything you can find.
Flight 4184 wasn't the only plane circling O'Hare that day. Several other planes were also on hold. They all landed safely. Interviews with the pilots of some of those planes give investigators an important clue.
One after another, they all experienced icing, some as much as 3/4 of an inch.
Many of the pilots report the same thing: ice. Dr. Marsha Politovich works at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. She's one of the leading experts on icing and the danger it poses to aircraft.
It essentially changes the shape of the wing while you're in flight. It creates drag, it reduces lift, it causes performance and handling problems, and it's just not a good thing to have.
Investigators examine weather records from the day of the crash. They find a disturbing pattern of reports of icing all along a cold front near Chicago. But the reports describe the icing as light to moderate. Perhaps the size of the commuter plane was a factor in this crash.
Yeah, different planes respond to icing differently. A large plane will respond differently than a small plane. Reasons for that are both environmental and having to do with the airframe itself.
large jets generally fly above the dangerous conditions inside a cloud. But the ATR-72 can't do that.
Smaller plane can't fly as high. They're stuck in the icing environment for longer. They may not have de-icing equipment, and if they get in trouble, they may not have enough excess power to get out of it.
Investigators discover that Flight 4184's holding pattern took it through layers of cloud repeatedly. Each time it would have been exposed to icing conditions.
4184 we knew had been holding in an icing event. There were layers of clouds that they had been flying in and out of.
Steve Frederick was flying out of Chicago on the morning of the crash. He flew through the same treacherous weather.
Each time that I went through that cold front during that day, the weather was intensifying, the ice was getting worse, and I was getting more and more concerned.
Frederick asked his captain to pass on a warning about the weather, so that other pilots would be alerted to the danger.
I found out a little bit later that my captain had never warned dispatch, and these pilots never got the warning about the ice that was out there that day. And there's no feeling in the world that can compare to how badly I felt at that moment.
Greg Feith knows that controllers had put several other planes into a holding pattern near Chicago. But they all landed safely after coming out of the hold. This means the controller had not put Flight 4184 in jeopardy. She acted correctly given the information she had about the weather.
One of the issues about air traffic control is that the controllers can't just look at their radar screen and identify areas of precipitation or icing conditions readily. The controllers don't know that an airplane is sitting in icing conditions unless the pilot provides them with what they call a PIREP or a pilot report. So if the crew, in this case, 4184, doesn't provide that information to the controller, then the controller doesn't know that an icing event actually is occurring out there.
Feith and his team wonder if the flight crew simply didn't realize they were flying into icy conditions. The plane's cockpit voice recorder provides the answer.
Can I get you boys anything? Cereal? You don't have a hard job.
You do have it pretty easy. Hey, bro. Getting busy with the ladies back here. Oh.
At first glance, the crew's behavior seems unprofessional and undisciplined.
The first officer was listening to some music. We knew that there were a lot of non-aviation things going on. One of the most contentious elements was how did that affect the crew's performance and their awareness to the situation that was starting to develop.
Well, that's much nicer now, flaps 15. Yeah. Showing some ice now.
But 9 minutes before the crash, the crew had noticed their plane was picking up ice. The pilots must have been aware they were flying through an area of aircraft icing.
You haven't heard any more from this controller chick, huh?
No, not a word.
Then, 2 minutes before the accident, another remark draws the attention of investigators.
Still got ice. I see what you mean.
The crew knew about the ice. Now investigators need to know what they did about it. The ATR-72 is equipped with sophisticated de-icing devices. It's crucial to know what the crew did about the ice buildup on their wings. This time, the flight data recorder provides the answers. Almost 17 minutes before the crash, something sets off the master caution warning. It could signal a problem in one of the plane's systems. It could also mean the electronic ice detector is picking up the presence of ice. The flight data recorder shows investigators that in response to the alert, Captain Aguiar turned the plane's de-icing system to its maximum setting. The NTSB's Charlie Pereira looks into the performance of the ATR-72.
The icing alert system had sounded orally, and they heard it, and they activated protection systems on the airplane. And at the time of the accident, the de-ice systems were on. The complete ice protection system on the ATR-72 airplane consists of a combination of what we call anti-icing, which are hot surfaces that don't allow the ice to form, windshields, and the propellers are also heated on this airplane. And then they have de-ice systems, which are on the leading edges of the wings, what are called pneumatic boots. They're like rubber inflatable chambers that you blow air into, and they expand kind of like a balloon, and that cracks in the ice, and then the ice flies off the airplane.
The flight data recorder shows that after he activated his de-icing system, Captain Aguiar also pushed the throttle forward slightly, increasing the plane's speed. This increased the speed of the air moving over the plane's wings, making it harder for ice to settle there. The pilots had done everything they could to deal with ice buildup on the plane. But were the anti-icing systems actually working? The shattered remains of that de-icing system are now the main focus of the investigation.
The airplane was designed in France by a group of French and Italian companies. The de-icing system was part of that design. So the components were made by small French vendors who were located around the countryside, and then they were assembled there in Toulouse into the final airplane.
Bob Swaim arrives in France with pieces of the de-icing system.
I brought some pieces from Flight 4184 to look at.
The key component to the de-icing system is probably not the black rubber boot that you see on the airplane, but the timer that's inside the airplane, or the timers and the valves that control those boots.
The force of the crash has left telltale markings called index marks. They show the position of the valves at the time of impact. Swaim compares them to the original blueprints.
Does anything seem out of the ordinary?
The trip to France has led to yet another dead end. There was nothing wrong with the plane's de-icing system.
Thanks a lot, appreciate it. Thank you.
Investigators are puzzled.
Showing some ice now.
If the crew knew they had ice on their wing and their de-icing system was working, why did the plane crash? Other pilots think they know the answer and decide to speak out. Their decision will dramatically change the course of this investigation. Three weeks after the crash near Roselawn, Indiana, American Eagle pilot Steve Frederick distributes a warning. It says the ATR-72 fleet operated by American Eagle is dangerous in icing conditions. It claims American Eagle pilots have pleaded with the airline and regulators to do something about it, but to no effect.
I drafted and distributed a brochure in Chicago O'Hare Airport, which essentially warned people about the problems with the ATR aircraft and made an outreach to the public in order to try and get something done because nothing was happening.
Steve Frederick has more than a professional interest in the crash of Flight 4184. Co-pilot Jeff Gagliano was his close friend. They graduated from flight school together. Gagliano's death has hit him hard.
He made the comment one time that he would probably wind up dying because of ice in an ATR. And it was eerily prophetic.
A month after the crash, pilot frustration over the ATR's airworthiness boils over. A group of a dozen pilots refuse to fly, citing risky weather. The airline is forced to cancel flights. And then Steve Frederick goes one step further. He voices his concerns on a US network morning show.
We were told this airplane will try and kill you. If you get too slow in ice, the airplane will have a nasty tendency to go out of control. When I came back to flying after my appearance on Good Morning America, I was summarily suspended without pay.
The public protest leads investigators to wonder if the ATR-72 has a deadly vulnerability to ice.
Merci.
Investigator Charlie Pereira visits the ATR's French manufacturer, Aerospatiale, to learn more about the plane's history.
We embarked on a research effort to try to identify all previous ATR 42 and 72 roll control incidents.
He finds a disturbing pattern.
And about five of those were found to be similar after the fact in our review to the Roselawn case.
One such incident took place in December 1988 in Mosinee, Wisconsin. An American Eagle ATR 42 had been preparing to land in icy conditions at central Wisconsin Airport.
The airplane was on approach in severe icing conditions, described as freezing drizzle and freezing rain.
Captain Mike Bodak was the pilot that day.
We were just on the last two legs of our trip before we'd be done with work. And we were doing our descent. Everything was proceeding normally.
Negative ice, just wet. I'll call the flight center and let them know we're turning inbound.
I hear in the tail a sound like that, but it just got louder and louder. We have no idea what is occurring. I thought initially a propeller blade may have come off. It was as if the steering wheel wasn't connected to anything.
The plane stalls. Its wings can't generate enough lift to keep it in the air.
As I see I'm not getting any of the airplane back, I come up on the power levers all the way. The engines are now really trying to fly. And at this point, I'm getting some of the airplane back, so I make a forward motion to try and break the stall. And it's still going terrain, terrain, and I don't have the airplane back yet. And my first officer says, and I say max RPM. He throws the props from 86 to 100%. And instantaneously, boom, we fly out of the stall.
The plane is less than 1,200 feet above the ground. Captain Bodak has learned a sobering lesson about the ATR.
There was no warning. The plane stalled without any warning. Planes do have warnings for stalls, but in this case, there was no warning. I got the first warning that I was in a stall was I was in a stall.
But other pilots weren't as lucky. An ATR-42 operated by an Italian airline was flying over the Alps en route to Germany in October 1987. The plane lost control and crashed in the mountains, killing all 37 people on board. Ice was the main factor, but the final report blamed pilot procedures.
For investigators, it's really important to look back at historical information about any airplane. You want to look for trends.
What they would find is a troubling detail with this plane's history.
Did any of your studies uncover a wing design flaw?
Charlie Pereira wants to know if the engineers who built the plane could explain why an ATR-72 would go so badly out of control. To his surprise, he learns they knew that it had a susceptibility to icing.
You've seen the flight data from the accident flight. Where would the ice have formed to cause that?
When I asked one of their oldest, most senior aerodynamicists who couldn't speak any English at all, what he thought would be the shape and location of an ice accretion that could cause the behavior that we saw on the flight recorder for the Roselawn airplane. He drew up the airfoil section, a little shape just behind the de-ice boots, and said this was it. And the translation was that this is what will cause this problem.
After the de-icing boot.
Investigator Charlie Pereira is beginning to understand how ice can affect the wings of the French-built plane. If the ice built up behind the boot, the crew would have no way to clear it.
Still got ice.
And even a small amount of ice can have a devastating effect on an airplane. Ice can disrupt the smooth movement of air over the wing. But how could so much ice build up behind the boot? Investigators contact Dr. Marcia Politovich for assistance.
The NTSB called us to help them analyze weather conditions in this case.
Her research shows that the pilots of Flight 4184 likely flew into something they'd never even heard of. Something even more dangerous than ordinary ice.
Based on the weather analysis, it looked to us like the kind of icing that plane encountered was from supercooled large drops. Now, large is relative. What we're talking about large here is about the size of a human hair.
Supercooled large droplets are about 100 times smaller than a raindrop. They form inside storm clouds when the temperature is near freezing. But the drops don't freeze until they come into contact with something solid, like the wing of an airplane. Conditions that day were ideal for the formation of these tiny freezing droplets.
We had all the clues that we needed, a warm cloud top, -8 to -12 degrees C. We had drizzle formation near the top that was probably encouraged by some wind shear near the cloud top, and very little ice in the cloud, from what we could tell.
On every lap of its holding pattern, Flight 4184 flew through layers of cloud that hid a small but lethal element.
They just put that poor guy in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Investigators learned that supercooled large droplets have a distinctive way of accumulating on an aircraft wing. Ordinary ice accumulates on the leading edge of the wing, where de-icing boots can get rid of it easily. But SLD act differently. These supercooled drops hit the wing and slide back over it before freezing. This forms a ridge behind the boots, out of reach of the de-icing system.
So as 4184 was flying in that type of environment, rather than the water droplet freezing on the protected surface of the de-ice boot, it actually ran behind the de-ice boot and froze on the metal surface.
The pilots can't get a good view of their wings from the cockpit. They would have been utterly unaware of the danger taking shape.
For the pilots, when they looked out their side window, they would see the outer portion of the wing. They definitely could not see the top of the wing, where this ice ridge was starting to form.
For Greg Feith, the investigation is coming to a head. His investigators think they know why Flight 4184 crashed, but they can't prove it. To make matters worse, the plane's manufacturer suggests that the Roselawn crash wasn't caused by an ice buildup, but by poor piloting.
The NTSB thought it was an aircraft problem, and the French aircraft manufacturer thought it was a pilot problem and not their particular product.
Feith wants to know if there had been problems with ice on ATR-built planes in the past. He finds troubling similarities between some incidents dating back decades. Using data from flight data recorders, investigators look at aileron movements from Flight 4184 and compare them to the other incidents. They discover that on all those flights, the aileron deflected in exactly the same way.
There's no input at all from the pilots.
We knew that all of these ailerons were being commanded to move, not by the pilot, but in fact the disrupted airflow created by the icing event that the airplane had encountered.
The physics of ice buildup explains why the control column on Flight 4184 snapped to the right. Air turbulence on the wing was so powerful that it lifted the aileron, which caused the plane to roll. Since the aileron is attached to the control column by a cable, it jerked the control yoke to the right. The force of the turbulence pulling on the aileron was so great that even two pilots trying to countersteer weren't able to bring the aileron back down.
The forces were determined to be about 250 pounds, so for the pilot, it would have been trying to roll against 250 pounds of aerodynamic force.
Worse, the ATR's control yoke doesn't have power steering, so those forces are transmitted directly to the pilots. The pilots could not fight back against the air pulling on their aileron. For Chief Investigator Greg Fife, supercooled water droplets that left a ridge of ice on the wings are now the prime suspect. But how to prove it?
Now the real analysis began because we had to understand what was going on in flight with the airplane. We had good flight data recorder information. It only told us what happened, didn't tell us why it happened. We had to try and model this icing event some way.
At the time of the crash, NASA was just beginning to study the effect of supercooled large droplets on airplanes.
Back in 1994, pilots didn't know what SLD or supercooled large droplets were. There was very little information in the pilot community, and there was actually very little information in the aviation industry about SLD.
Investigators first turned to NASA for help. Together, they launch a daring experiment. They use a US Air Force tanker plane to create a cloud of supercooled water droplets. An ATR-72 flies behind the tanker. Yellow dye in the water shows investigators how the droplets cover the plane. The test should solve the final mystery. How had ice caused Flight 4184 to go so badly out of control?
One of the primary purposes of flying the ATR-72 in behind the tanker was to understand how the ice accumulated on the airplane, but more importantly, the effect of that ice in varying configurations of the airplane on the flight control surfaces, that is, the ailerons.
Investigators make a startling discovery. A seemingly harmless action meant to increase comfort on the plane may have led to disaster.
Can I get you boys anything?
I'm good.
While American Eagle Flight 4184 was holding, Captain Orlando Aguiar notices that the nose is tipped quite high.
This thing gets a real high deck angle in these turns. Yeah.
Captain Aguiar knows that the plane's high nose angle was producing an uncomfortable tilt in the passenger cabin.
You want flaps 15?
I'll bring the nose down.
Sure.
Extending the flaps would have the effect of lowering the plane's nose, making the ride more comfortable.
I guess Sandy's going woo now.
When investigators duplicated this maneuver, they found that it had a dramatic effect on where the ice ridge formed on the plane's wing. The flaps made the icing problem even worse.
By exposing more of the upper surface of the wing to the oncoming water droplets, and that's one of the reasons why we got the ridge of ice where we got it, was because of the flaps 15 configuration.
That's much nicer now, flaps 15. Yeah.
The crew of Flight 4184 is unaware that a ridge of ice, more than a centimeter high, has built up on the surface of their wings.
Eagle Flight 184, descend and maintain 8,000.
Down to 8,000, Eagle 184.
The ice buildup has no effect on the flight until First Officer Gagliano begins his descent to 8,000 feet.
I knew we'd do that.
The descent increases the plane's airspeed. This triggers a warning from the flight computer telling the crew they're flying too fast with the flaps extended.
I was trying to keep it at 180.
Gagliano now retracts the flaps. But the routine gesture has a dramatic effect on the plane's aerodynamics.
When they retracted the flaps, as they started their descent down to 8,000 feet, the airplane pitched back up into a very nose-high attitude.
Airflow over the ice-laden wing was disrupted when the nose lifted back up. That created the turbulence that pulled up the ailerons, sending the plane into a roll. The plane stalled and tumbled from the sky.
Had this crew had about 2,000 to 3,000 more feet of altitude, there's a high probability that they would have been able to salvage or recover the airplane before it struck the ground.
The NTSB has uncovered a deadly flaw in a popular airplane. There's a growing concern that unless something is done, this kind of accident would soon happen again. Investigators conclude that problems with the ATR's wing design make it vulnerable to this menace. The agency that regulates U.S. aviation takes drastic action.
We are going to issue an airworthiness directive this afternoon that will preclude the operation of these aircraft into known icing conditions.
The FAA takes swift action, banning all models of the aircraft from flying in icy conditions. This throws regional airlines like American Eagle into chaos. Public concern over the safety of ATR airplanes grows in the aftermath of the Roselawn crash. The most controversial charge: that the FAA had relied on the French authorities to test and certify the aircraft, then rubber-stamped the results.
Therefore, the ATR-72 was never really tested by the FAA in any way, shape, and form as though it was manufactured here.
The plane's French builder proposes to fix the problem by making the de-icing boots wider so they cover a larger part of the wing. The company also rewrites operating procedures, forbidding pilots from using the flaps or flying on autopilot in icing conditions. In response, the FAA issues an amendment to their earlier directive, loosening operating restrictions on the ATRs. Most airlines decide not to take any chances. They move their ATRs to the south, where a warmer climate would reduce the risk of ice. The crash at Roselawn set off a flurry of new research into aircraft icing and the conditions that produce it.
There's a lot of weather data out there. Satellites, radars, surface obs, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, the collection of data.
New techniques in forecasting are being developed to show pilots where icing is likely to occur and help them avoid it.
But we're working on ways to get it to the people who need it. Dispatchers at airlines, meteorologists at airlines, and now even into the cockpit itself.
Many of those changes will take time to come into effect. Pilots like Steve Frederick think that time will cost lives.
The problem that exists is that there is no technology available today to the pilots or anyone on the ground to accurately forecast or predict where these situations of bad ice are going to occur. Once these airplanes have been exposed to the bad ice, it's too late, because these are no longer airline pilots, they're test pilots, and that airplane can fall out from under them and their passengers without any warning and in the blink of an eye.